I can feel the hum of a cassette deck spinning somewhere in the distance, the faint static of a television not quite tuned to any channel, and the particular quality of light that seems to belong only to a certain stretch of years, those years that arrived quietly in the mid-1960s and stretched themselves across decades like shadows lengthening at dusk. There is something about walking through memory as though it were a physical landscape, moving through the textures of a time that shaped itself around a generation born into the spaces between things, between the wide-eyed optimism that came before and the digital acceleration that would come after, a generation that grew up in the margins, in the quiet, in the flickering glow of after-school specials and the blue light of arcade machines. The air feels different here, as though I've stepped into a photograph that hasn't quite developed, the colors slightly muted, the edges soft, and there's a certain quality to the silence, not empty, but full of distant sounds, the mechanical click of a rotary phone returning to rest, the whir of a VCR rewinding, the particular resonance of a screen door closing on a summer evening when the streetlights have just begun to flicker on. Generation X, a name that arrived later, a label applied to those born roughly between 1965 and 1980, though the boundaries blur and shift depending on who's drawing the map, somewhere between 60 and 65 million souls in America alone, defined less by what they were and more by what they were not. Not boomers, not millennials, but something else, something that existed in the space between declarations. And there's something almost fitting about that, about being named for a variable, for an unknown quantity. X marking a spot on a map that no one had drawn yet, a generation that would grow up watching their parents' certainties dissolve, watching institutions reveal themselves as fragile, learning early that the center might not hold, that the script they'd been handed might not match the play they'd be performing. I can almost see them now, those children of the 70s and 80s, coming home to empty houses because both parents worked or because there was only one parent, turning keys that hung on yarn necklaces, letting themselves into silence, into the particular independence that arrives when no one is watching, when you must figure things out yourself, when the television becomes a companion and the refrigerator offers its own kind of comfort, the latchkey kids, they called them. And there's something in that phrase, something about keys and locks and the early understanding that you are responsible for yourself, that the door you open is yours to open, that the threshold you cross is yours to navigate. The landscape of their childhood was particular, specific, shaped by economic shifts and cultural tremors. Divorce rates climbing through the 1970s, reaching heights no previous generation had witnessed, nearly half of all marriages dissolving, and so many of these children watching the mythology of the nuclear family fracture, learning to move between houses, between parents, between versions of truth, and the world they inhabited carried the residue of disillusionment. Watergate unfolding when the oldest among them were still in elementary school. Vietnam ending in images of helicopters lifting from rooftops. The oil crisis and gas lines, and a sense that abundance might not be infinite after all. The Cold War persisting like a low-grade fever, the possibility of annihilation humming beneath everything. There were drills, though not as many as their parents had endured, but still, the knowledge that somewhere missiles pointed, that the world could end in an afternoon, and perhaps this shaped something. Perhaps this contributed to the particular stance this generation would take, skeptical, ironic, unwilling to invest too heavily in grand narratives that might evaporate. The media they consumed reflected this, or maybe shaped it, or maybe both things happened simultaneously in that strange feedback loop between culture and consciousness. Saturday morning cartoons gave way to MTV in 1981. Suddenly, music had pictures. Suddenly, image and sound merged in new ways, and they were there, the oldest ones teenagers, the youngest ones children, all of them absorbing this new language. And the movies, the films of the late 70s and 80s, filled with darkness and ambiguity, even in their entertainment. Suburban nightmares and body horror and comedies edged with cruelty. John Hughes capturing something true about the taxonomy of high school hierarchies, the way teenagers can be both vulnerable and vicious, the way systems sort and label and constrain. I can feel the texture of those years, the particular grain of it, like running fingers across the ridged plastic of a trapper-keeper, or the smooth weight of a Walkman, or the satisfying resistance of a joystick in an arcade cabinet. Technology arriving but not yet ubiquitous, not yet seamless, still mechanical, still requiring participation, still tactile, and there's something in the music they claimed as their own. Punk and post-punk and grunge, sounds that rejected polish, that embraced dissonance, that said the emperor has no clothes, that refused to pretend everything was fine. Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden emerging from Seattle like reports from the front lines of a different kind of war, a war against phoniness, against the slick surfaces that promised nothing underneath. The economic landscape they inherited was shifting beneath their feet, even as they couldn't yet name it. Manufacturing jobs disappearing, the social contract their parents had known beginning to fray, pensions becoming less certain, loyalty between employer and employee becoming a quaint memory. And they would be the first generation in American history predicted to do worse economically than their parents, but none of that is fully visible yet. Not in this opening moment, not as we stand here at the threshold of their story, looking in at the particular light of their becoming, at the spaces they inhabited, at the silence they learned to navigate, at the independence they cultivated not by choice, but by circumstance. The story begins before the generation itself. In the aftermath of victory and the glow of prosperity, when the soldiers returned and the factories hummed and an entire nation seemed to believe that progress was a straight line pointing upward, the baby boom arrived like a population explosion, like a demographic tidal wave. 76 million births between 1946 and 1964, a generation so large it would warp every institution it passed through like a planet-bending space-time. And in the shadow of that boom, in the quiet that followed, the birth rates began to fall, dropping steadily through the 1960s and into the 70s, smaller families becoming the norm. Contraception becoming widely available after the pill's approval in 1960. Abortion legalized in 1973. Women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The whole architecture of American family life shifting. So the children born into this new landscape arrived into something different. Into families with 1 or 2 children instead of 4 or 5, into homes where both parents often worked, into a culture that had grown uncertain about its own mythology. They were born as the counterculture peaked and then dissolved, as Woodstock gave way to Altamont, as the dream of the 1960s curdled into the hangover of the 70s. The oldest of them, those born in the mid-1960s, arrived during the escalation of Vietnam, during the height of the civil rights movement, during the British invasion and the folk revival. But they were too young to remember these things directly. They would know them only as history, as stories told, as footage replayed, always arriving just after the moment had passed. And perhaps this is where the sensibility begins, in this position of being just slightly too late, of inheriting a world that had already happened, that had already made its crucial choices. Their parents had Woodstock and the March on Washington and the moon landing, and they had what? The aftermath, the consequences, the world those events had created, the economic conditions of their birth years tell one kind of story. The post-war boom that had lifted the boomers was already fading by the time Generation X arrived. The oil crisis of 1973 shocked a nation accustomed to abundance. Gas lines formed, prices rose. The assumption of endless growth began to wobble. Stagflation set in, that peculiar condition where prices rise but the economy stagnates, where everything costs more but opportunities contract. Their early childhood unfolded against this backdrop. The 1970s, with its earth tones and energy consciousness, and a certain national malaise that President Carter would name in 1979, a crisis of confidence, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the American century might not stretch as far as people had assumed. But for the children themselves, for those too young to understand economics or geopolitics, the world simply was what it was. They learned to entertain themselves, to create elaborate games with whatever materials were at hand, to disappear into neighborhoods for hours, to range freely in a way that would become unthinkable for later generations. The divorce rate tells another story, a quiet revolution happening in living rooms and courtrooms across the country. In 1960, the divorce rate was 0.9 per thousand married women. By 1975, it had reached 4.8. By 1980, it peaked at 5.2, more than 5 times higher than it had been just 2 decades earlier. This meant that these children, these early members of Generation X, experienced family dissolution at rates unprecedented in American history. They became fluent in the language of custody arrangements and visitation schedules. They learned to pack bags and move between households, to maintain separate versions of themselves for separate parents, to navigate the emotional minefields of adults who had chosen to unchoose each other, and the media reflected this shift, or perhaps drove it, or perhaps both. Norman Lear's television shows brought divorce and single parenthood into prime time. One Day at a Time premiered in 1975, featuring a divorced mother raising 2 daughters alone. The Jeffersons and Good Times showed different models of family, the nuclear ideal fragmenting into multiple possibilities. But it wasn't just divorce that reshaped the landscape of childhood. It was the simple fact of parental absence, of both parents working because one income no longer sufficed, because inflation ate at purchasing power, because the dream of middle-class stability required 2 paychecks where one had previously been enough. The term latchkey kid entered the popular vocabulary in the early 1980s, though the phenomenon had been building throughout the 70s. Children as young as 6 or 7 letting themselves into empty homes, microwaving their own dinners, doing homework without supervision, learning self-sufficiency not as a character-building exercise but as a simple necessity. Studies from the era suggest that somewhere between 5 and 15 million children were regularly home alone after school by the early 1980s. The numbers, how some vary depending on definition and methodology, but the phenomenon was real enough, visible enough, that it sparked debates about parental responsibility and childhood safety and the costs of economic transformation, and these children developed particular competencies, particular ways of being. They learned to be comfortable with solitude, to trust their own judgment, to solve problems independently. They became adept at reading situations, at assessing risk, at navigating systems without adult guidance. The educational landscape they entered was shifting as well. The progressive reforms of the 1960s and 70s brought open classrooms and new math and a move away from rote learning, but it also brought inconsistency. Schools became laboratories for competing theories. Curricula changed frequently, and these children moved through systems that were themselves uncertain about what they were supposed to accomplish. Desegregation busing continued through the 1970s, particularly in northern cities like Boston, where violent resistance erupted in 1974. These children attended schools that were battlegrounds for larger social conflicts, places where the unfinished business of civil rights played out in hallways and classrooms. And then there was the specter of violence. School shootings were not yet the epidemic they would become, but there were incidents, there were scares, and more broadly, there was a rising awareness of danger, of stranger danger specifically. The face on the milk carton became a fixture of breakfast tables in the early 1980s, missing children staring out from waxed cardboard. Though the actual rate of stranger abduction remained statistically tiny, but the perception mattered, the feeling that the world had become less safe, that children needed to be warned and protected and taught to be suspicious. And this too shaped the generation, this combination of independence and anxiety, of freedom and fear. The technological landscape of their early years was analog, mechanical, visible. You could see how things worked. A cassette tape was literally the music, wound on spools. A record was grooves that a needle traced. A television had tubes that glowed. A telephone had a cord that connected you physically to the conversation. Video games arrived, but they were public, social. You went to an arcade. You stood in line. You watched other players. You learned by observation. Space Invaders in 1978, Pac-Man in 1980, Donkey Kong in 1981, each one a phenomenon, each one a gathering place. A quarter bought you a few minutes of play and entry into a subculture. Home computers began to appear. The Commodore 64 launched in 1982, selling millions of units. Suddenly programming was something a kid could do, sitting in a bedroom, typing commands into a beige box connected to a television, making pixels move, creating simple games, learning a new literacy. But this was still niche, still the province of hobbyists and enthusiasts. Most children experienced technology as something separate from daily life, something you encountered at specific times and places, not yet the seamless integration that would define later eras, the music of their childhood, The sounds that played from car radios and bedroom stereos reflected the fragmentation of culture. Disco and punk emerging simultaneously in the mid-70s, occupying completely different worlds. Disco with its celebration and excess, punk with its rejection and reduction. Both responses to the same moment, but pointing in opposite directions. And by the early 1980s, MTV launched in August of 1981 with the Buggles singing "Video Killed the Radio Star," and suddenly music had a visual language. Suddenly artists needed to think about image as much as sound, and the children of Generation X absorbed this, learned to read music video as a grammar, as a way of telling stories. They were there for the dawn of hip-hop, for the block parties in the Bronx in the mid-70s, where DJs like Kool Herc isolated the break, where MCs began to rhyme over beats, where a culture emerged from the wreckage of urban disinvestment, from communities that had been abandoned and had created something new in the abandonment. The Cold War provided the constant background radiation of their childhood, détente in the early 70s, giving way to renewed tension in the late 70s and early 80s. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the election of Reagan in 1980, bringing a harder line, a military buildup, rhetoric about the evil empire. These children grew up knowing, in some abstract way, that missiles pointed at them, that cities had targets painted on them. The television movie The Day After aired in November of 1983, showing the aftermath of nuclear war, and 100 million people watched, including countless children who absorbed images of radiation sickness and social collapse. But alongside the apocalyptic anxiety, there was also a strange normalization. The threat became background, became something you lived with rather than something you actively feared. These children practiced duck and cover drills less than their parents had, but they knew the symbols. They understood the stakes, and perhaps it contributed to a certain fatalism, a sense that the future was uncertain, that planning too far ahead might be pointless. The environmental consciousness that emerged in the 1970s shaped their early education. Earth Day, beginning in 1970, concern about pollution and resource depletion becoming part of school curricula. They learned about endangered species and acid rain and the ozone layer. They learned that human activity had consequences, that the world was fragile, and they learned it during a time when manufacturing jobs were beginning to disappear, when the Rust Belt was beginning to rust, when factories that had employed thousands were closing, when entire communities built around industries found those industries relocating or automating or simply vanishing. The older members of Generation X, those born in the mid to late 1960s, have vague memories of the bicentennial in 1976, of red, white, and blue everywhere, of tall ships and fireworks, of a nation trying to celebrate itself even as it remained uncertain about its direction, trying to find continuity with its founding even as so much seemed to be changing. And as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, as these children moved from early childhood into their school years, the landscape continued to shift beneath them. Reagan's election in 1980 brought a new tone, a new optimism that felt forced to some, that felt like a rejection of nuance. Morning in America, the slogan would say, but for many of these children, for many of their families, morning felt more complicated than that. The schools they attended in the 1980s carried the weight of competing philosophies. Standardized testing was increasing. The Nation at Risk report arrived in 1983, declaring that American education was failing, that mediocrity threatened the nation's future. And so the reforms began. More testing, more accountability, more pressure on teachers and students alike to perform, to measure up, to prove their worth through numbers. But these children, these young members of Generation X, were also experiencing education in other ways, through after-school specials that taught lessons about drugs and peer pressure and stranger danger, through PBS programming like 321 Contact and Square One TV that made science and math feel accessible, through Reading Rainbow, where LeVar Burton invited them to explore books and ideas. The library became a refuge for many, a place of quiet and possibility. Card catalogs still filled drawers. The Dewey Decimal System still organized knowledge into numbered categories. Librarians still stamped due dates onto cards tucked into pockets, and children learned to navigate these systems, to follow chains of research from one book to another, to lose themselves in encyclopedias. The Scholastic Book Fair arrived at schools with its spinner racks of paperbacks, its posters and bookmarks, and that particular smell of new books. And for a few days, the library or cafeteria transformed into a marketplace of stories. Choose your own adventure books, promising agency. R.L. Stein's Fear Street, and later Goosebumps, providing safe scares. Judy Blume telling truths about bodies and feelings that adults often avoided. Recess and lunch hours had their own complex social ecosystems. Playgrounds were sites of negotiation and hierarchy. Tetherball and foursquare and kickball games with rules that varied by region and school. Trading happening constantly. Baseball cards and stickers and garbage pail kids. Small economies of desire and exchange. The older students, those entering adolescence in the mid to late 80s, encountered a particular cultural moment, the rise of the mall as social space, as the place you went not necessarily to buy, but to see and be seen, to walk in loops past the same stores, to linger in the arcade or the food court, to establish identity through proximity and association. Brand consciousness intensified during this period. Suddenly, the labels mattered. The right jeans, the right shoes, Jordache and Gloria Vanderbilt and Calvin Klein for denim, Nike and Reebok for sneakers, and the hierarchies were brutal. Who could afford what? Who wore the knockoffs? Who showed up in the wrong thing and paid the social price? John Hughes' films captured something true about this moment. 16 Candles in 1984. The Breakfast Club in 1985. Pretty in Pink in 1986. Showing teenagers as complex beings. Showing the cruelty of high school castes. Showing class divisions and the pain of not belonging. And these films became mirrors, became ways of understanding experience, became shared reference points. The music was fragmenting further. MTV, now fully established, playing new wave and post-punk and hair metal and the emerging sounds of hip-hop. Michael Jackson's Thriller in 1982 becoming the best-selling album of all time. The video, a short film, a production, Madonna constantly reinventing herself, Prince blurring every boundary, and underneath, in the underground, punk was evolving into hardcore, into alternative rock. College radio stations became crucial, places where you could hear things that would never make it onto commercial radio. The Smiths and The Cure and R.E.M. and Sonic Youth. sounds that felt different, that felt like they were speaking to something the mainstream missed, and teenagers with cassette decks learned to record, to make mixtapes, to curate their own soundtracks. The AIDS crisis emerged in the early 1980s, first as a mysterious illness affecting gay men, then as an epidemic, then as a full-blown crisis that the Reagan administration largely ignored. Rock Hudson's death in 1985 made it real to mainstream America. Suddenly, this wasn't a distant problem. It was someone they knew, someone they'd watched on television, and the children of Generation X absorbed this, absorbed the fear and misinformation, absorbed the sex education that became increasingly focused on danger and death, absorbed the understanding that sex could kill you, that desire carried mortal stakes. Just say no became the slogan for drugs, for sex, for anything that might lead anywhere complicated. DARE programs arrived in schools in the mid-'80s. Police officers teaching children about drug resistance, showing them pictures of marijuana and cocaine and crack, explaining the dangers, using scare tactics, and the children sat through these presentations, absorbing messages about a drug war that was ramping up, that would eventually incarcerate millions, that would devastate communities. The crack epidemic hit urban areas hard in the mid to late 80s, a cheaper form of cocaine flooding neighborhoods. Violence following, the crime rate rising, news coverage focusing on crack babies and super predators, language that dehumanized, that justified increasingly punitive approaches, that treated addiction as moral failure rather than public health crisis. These children watched their cities change, watched neighborhoods decline or gentrify, watched the homeless population grow visible on streets, a consequence of deinstitutionalization and rising housing costs and the cutting of social services, and they learned to step over bodies on sidewalks, learned to look away, learned that society didn't necessarily take care of its vulnerable. The Challenger explosion happened on January 28, 1986, 73 seconds after launch, and millions of school children watched live, watched the shuttle breaks apart, watched the smoke trails diverge, and teachers scrambled to explain, to process, to help children understand that sometimes things fail catastrophically, that sometimes people die on television, that sometimes there is no good explanation. Krista McAuliffe was supposed to be the first teacher in space, and schools across the country had tuned in to watch, and instead they witnessed disaster. And for many of these children, it became a defining memory, the moment when the promise of technology, the forward march of progress, revealed itself as fragile, as capable of spectacular failure. The Cold War continued its evolution. Gorbachev came to power in 1985, brought glasnost and perestroika, brought a thawing. Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik in 1986, talked about eliminating nuclear weapons, didn't reach agreement, but began a process, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the background radiation of nuclear anxiety began to diminish, but the culture of the late 80s also brought excess, Wall Street, and corporate raiders, and the celebration of wealth, Michael Douglas in Wall Street declaring that greed is good, Dynasty and Dallas showing lifestyles of impossible luxury, and a growing divide between rich and poor, between those who benefited from Reaganomics and those who didn't. And the children noticed, absorbed the message that money mattered, that winning mattered, that compassion was weakness, Video games were evolving. The Nintendo Entertainment System, launched in North America in 1985, brought gaming into living rooms in a new way. Super Mario Bros. Became iconic. The Legend of Zelda offered adventure and exploration, and children spent hours in pixelated worlds, developing spatial reasoning and problem-solving skills, learning persistence through repeated failure and retry. The Satanic Panic swept through communities in the mid to late 80s, a moral panic about heavy metal music and role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Accusations that these were gateways to devil worship. Parental advisory labels appeared on albums in 1985 after Tipper Gore and the Parents Music Resource Center pushed for them, and teenagers learned that their music, their games, their culture was suspect, was dangerous in the eyes of adults. The literature they encountered in school often felt disconnected from their lives. Classics chosen for their canonical status rather than their relevance, but some teachers were beginning to incorporate young adult literature. S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, resonating with its themes of class conflict and alienation. Robert Cormier's The Chocolate War, showing institutional corruption and the cost of resistance. And outside of school, they were reading, consuming stories in multiple formats. Comic books were experiencing a renaissance. Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns both arrived in 1986, showing that the medium could handle complexity and darkness, that superheroes could be examined critically, deconstructed, revealed as problematic. The television landscape was expanding, cable bringing more channels, more options. Nickelodeon launching in 1979, but really finding its voice in the 80s with shows made specifically for children and teenagers. Not talking down, not sanitizing. MTV providing a constant stream of music and culture. CNN bringing 24-hour news. And so information was increasing. Access was expanding, but it was still bounded, still limited. You couldn't look something up instantly. You had to go to a library or wait for a program to air or ask someone who might know. Knowledge still required effort, still required patience, still required knowing where to look. The fashion of the late 80s was particular. Neon colors and big hair and shoulder pads and leg warmers and members-only jackets, and teenagers navigated these trends with varying degrees of enthusiasm, trying to figure out who they were, what they wanted to project, how to fit in while also standing out. Skateboarding culture grew throughout the 80s. Thrasher magazine launching in 1981, bringing punk aesthetics and DIY attitude to a sport that was becoming more than a sport, becoming a lifestyle, a way of seeing the city as a playground, of treating architecture as something to be used rather than just observed. The Brat Pack emerged from Hughes Films and other 80s movies. Molly Ringwald and Emilio Estevez and Rob Lowe and Demi Moore. Young actors playing young people, and teenagers saw versions of themselves on screen, saw their struggles reflected, even if filtered through Hollywood's lens, even if sanitized and packaged. Spring break culture intensified. MTV's coverage beginning in 1986, showing masses of college students on beaches, drinking and dancing in excess, and younger teenagers absorbed these images, understood that this was supposed to be the goal, the reward, the release. But underneath all of this, underneath the consumer culture and the media saturation and the various panics, these young people were developing particular ways of being, particular adaptive strategies. They were learning to be skeptical, to question authority, to trust their own judgment over institutional claims. They were learning irony as a defense mechanism, a way of engaging with culture without being consumed by it, a way of participating while also maintaining distance. And this ironic stance would later be read as apathy or cynicism. But perhaps it was simply armor, simply a way of protecting yourself in a world that had proven itself unreliable. The oldest among them were graduating high school by the late 80s, entering college or the workforce, facing decisions about their futures, and the economy they inherited was complex. The stock market had crashed in October of 1987, Black Monday, the Dow Jones dropping 22% in a single day, but recovering, but leaving uncertainty. College was becoming more expensive, student loans more necessary. The GI Bill had subsidized their parents' generation, but now education meant debt, meant starting adult life in the red, meant making calculations about whether degrees were worth their cost. And as the 1980s drew toward their close, as the decade that had shaped so much of Generation X's childhood and adolescence began to give way to something new, there was a sense of transition, of threshold. The Berlin Wall would fall in November of 1989. The Cold War would end. The Soviet Union would collapse. And the world these young people had grown up in, the bipolar certainties, the nuclear standoff, would dissolve into something more uncertain, more multipolar, more complex. The 1990s arrived with a strange energy. The oldest members of Generation X were now in their mid-20s, entering the workforce in earnest, starting careers or bouncing between jobs, and the youngest were still children, still in elementary school. The span of the generation wide enough that their experiences diverged significantly, but certain threads connected them all. The Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, and suddenly the Cold War was over. The framework that had organized global politics for decades simply dissolved. The threat of nuclear annihilation didn't disappear, but it receded, became less immediate. And there was a sense of possibility, of doors opening, but also disorientation, the old certainties gone without clear replacements. Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, suggested that liberal democracy had won, that ideological struggle was over, and this idea circulated through universities and opinion pages, but many of these young adults felt skeptical, felt that history wasn't over so much as entering a new phase, one harder to categorize, one less binary. The economy of the early 90s was struggling. A recession hit in 1990 and 91. Unemployment rose. Companies downsized, and the oldest members of Generation X found themselves graduating into a job market that didn't want them, that had no positions for English majors or philosophy students. That demanded experience they hadn't yet acquired, and so they cobbled together, worked retail and food service, took unpaid internships, moved back in with parents, delayed the traditional markers of adulthood, marriage and home ownership and children, not because they didn't want these things, but because the economic foundation felt unstable, because the ladder their parents had climbed seemed to have rungs missing. Slacker culture emerged as a label, as a media narrative. Richard Linklater's film Slacker in 1991, showing young people in Austin drifting through days, talking philosophy and conspiracy theories, not particularly ambitious in conventional terms, and the media seized on this, declared an entire generation lazy, unmotivated, cynical. Douglas Coupland's novel, Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture, was published in March of 1991, and suddenly the generation had a name that stuck, not a demographic term, but a cultural one, X as unknown, as variable, as placeholder, and the book captured something, the Mac jobs and the poverty, the sense of coming after something significant, of inheriting a world already used. Grunge exploded from Seattle. Nirvana's Nevermind, released in September of 1991. Smells Like Teen Spirit, becoming an anthem. Kurt Cobain's voice raw and pained and real. Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains bringing similar sounds. Flannel shirts and ripped jeans becoming the anti-fashion fashion, rejecting the gloss of the 80s, embracing authenticity, or at least its appearance. And the music mattered, spoke to something these young people felt, a disaffection, a resistance to corporate culture, a desire for something unpolished, something that acknowledged pain and confusion rather than papering over it with optimism. The angst was real, even if it became commodified, even if flannel ended up in fashion spreads. MTV shifted its programming. The Real World premiered in 1992. 7 strangers picked to live in a house, have their lives taped, and reality television was born. Suddenly, private life became public performance. Suddenly, the camera was always on, and young people absorbed this, understood that life could be content, that personality could be product. The internet was beginning its transformation from academic network to public utility. The World Wide Web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989. The first web browser, Mosaic, launched in 1993. And slowly, for those with access to computers and modems, a new world opened, bulletin board systems, and chat rooms, and early websites. But this was still limited, still the province of tech enthusiasts and university students. Most people experienced the internet through news stories, through vague awareness that something was happening, something about information and connectivity, but it hadn't yet touched daily life, hadn't yet become ubiquitous. The youngest members of Generation X were moving through their teenage years now, experiencing high school in the mid-90s, and the culture had shifted. The optimism of the Reagan years felt distant. The Cold War was over, but new anxieties had replaced it. The L.A. riots in 1992, after the Rodney King verdict showed racial tensions still simmering, showed that injustice persisted, that violence could erupt. The Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995 brought terrorism to the American heartland, not from foreign enemies, but from domestic ones. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols killing 168 people, destroying a federal building, and the nation grappled with the idea that the threat came from within, that extremism had American roots. School shootings began to penetrate consciousness, not yet the epidemic of later decades, but incidents occurring, and the school shooting that would truly mark a threshold was still ahead. Columbine would come in April of 1999, but already the sense of schools as vulnerable spaces was building, metal detectors appearing, zero-tolerance policies implementing. The culture wars continued, battles over political correctness on college campuses, debates about multiculturalism and canon formation. conservative critics claiming that traditional values were under assault, progressive voices pushing for inclusion and recognition of previously marginalized perspectives, and Generation X students found themselves navigating these debates, often with more nuance than either side wanted. Independent film flourished in the 90s, Sundance becoming important. Filmmakers like Kevin Smith and Richard Linklater and Quentin Tarantino making movies outside the studio system. Clerks in 1994 made for $27,000, showing that you didn't need Hollywood, that you could tell your own stories your own way. Zines proliferated. Photocopied publications made by individuals, distributed through independent bookstores and record shops and mail order. Riot Grrrl emerged from punk scenes. Bikini Kill and Bratmobile bringing feminist politics and raw sound, creating spaces for women and girls in scenes that had been male-dominated, challenging sexism directly, loudly. The technology sector was growing. Silicon Valley beginning its transformation into the center of the tech world, and some members of Generation X were there, writing code, building companies, understanding that computers were the future, that the internet would change everything, though exactly how remained unclear. Others were skeptical, saw technology as alienating, preferred analog, preferred face-to-face, preferred the tactile, and this tension would persist. This divide between those who embraced the digital and those who resisted it, though eventually resistance became mostly futile, the digital would subsume everything. The job market improved as the 90s progressed. The tech boom creating opportunities, the economy expanding, unemployment dropping. And those members of Generation X who had struggled in the early 90s found their footing, found careers, began to establish themselves, though often without the stability their parents had known, without pensions, without guarantees. The youngest members were graduating high school in the late 90s, entering college or the workforce, and they encountered a different landscape than their older cohort had. The economy was strong, jobs were available, the internet was becoming normal, cell phones were spreading, though still expensive, still clunky, still mostly for talking. Popular culture was fragmenting further, cable channels multiplying, niche programming emerging. The monoculture that had existed in the 70s and 80s was dissolving. People could choose their own media diets, construct their own cultural universes, and this meant less shared experience, less common ground, more divergence. Coffee culture exploded, Starbucks expanding rapidly through the 90s, third wave coffee emerging, and suddenly coffee was lifestyle, was identity, was something you could be a connoisseur of. And this fit with the emerging sensibility, the attention to quality and authenticity, the willingness to pay more for something better, or at least different. Fashion in the 90s moved through phases, grunge giving way to minimalism, to rave culture, to hip-hop influences, to the late 90s revival of 70s aesthetics. And through it all, these young people were figuring out who they were, trying on identities, discarding them, refining their sense of self through trial and error. The political landscape shifted. Clinton was president through most of the 90s, and his administration brought a kind of centrist politics, triangulation, welfare reform that critics saw as abandoning the poor, a strong economy but growing inequality. NAFTA passing in 1994, further integrating economies, accelerating deindustrialization in some regions, and Generation X largely disengaged from politics. Voter turnout among young people was low, the sense that both parties served similar interests, that real change wasn't on the ballot, that individual choice mattered more than collective action. This would later be read as apathy, but perhaps it was disillusionment. Perhaps it was a realistic assessment of limited options. The Monica Lewinsky scandal broke in 1998, and suddenly the president's private life was everywhere, on cable news, in newspapers, and there was something exhausting about it, something that confirmed cynicism, that suggested power always corrupted, that everyone was compromised. The Y2K panic built through 1999, fears that computer systems would fail when the year rolled over, that planes would fall from the sky, that infrastructure would collapse, and people stockpiled supplies, prepared for catastrophe, and nothing happened. Midnight came. The year changed to 2000, and everything kept working, and perhaps this too was instructive, that sometimes the threatened disasters don't arrive, that sometimes fear exceeds reality. But there was also genuine transition happening, the millennium turning, a symbolic threshold, even if arbitrary, and the oldest members of Generation X were now in their mid-30s, establishing careers, some starting families, buying houses in some cases, delaying these milestones in others, and the youngest were leaving adolescence, entering their 20s, inheriting a world that felt both more connected and more uncertain than the one their older siblings had known. The dot-com bubble was inflating, stock prices for internet companies rising to absurd heights, IPOs making millionaires, and there was a sense of irrational exuberance, a feeling that old rules didn't apply, that we were in a new paradigm, and some members of Generation X rode this wave, worked for startups, got stock options, believed in the revolution. The music continued to evolve. Hip-hop was mainstream now, no longer underground. Artists like Tupac and Biggie before their deaths, Jay-Z and Nas and Wu-Tang Clan, and white suburban kids were listening, were adopting styles, were participating in a culture that had emerged from entirely different circumstances. And this created tensions, questions about appropriation and authenticity. And as the 20th century drew to its close, as this generation that had been born in the shadow of the boomers, that had grown up during dissolution and transformation, that had learned independence and skepticism and irony, they were entering their full adulthood, taking positions of responsibility, beginning to shape institutions rather than just moving through them, but they remained shaped by what they'd experienced, by the divorces and the latchkey afternoons and the economic uncertainty and the Cold War's end and the music that spoke to displacement. And these experiences had created particular ways of being, particular values and sensibilities, a preference for authenticity over polish, for independence over conformity, for questioning over accepting. And perhaps what matters most when considering this generation, when standing at a distance and observing the arc of their journey, is not the labels that were applied to them, not slacker or cynic or latchkey kid, but rather the adaptations they made, the skills they developed, the particular form of resilience that emerges from being left to figure things out alone. They learned early that institutions were fallible, that marriages could end, that companies felt no loyalty, that governments lied, that the social contract was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit, and this knowledge, this awareness of contingency, shaped everything that followed. There's a kind of pragmatism that develops when you grow up watching systems fail, when you learn that the safety net has holes, that the ladder has missing rungs. You become resourceful, you learn to pivot, you develop what would later be called entrepreneurial mindset, though really it's just the ability to survive when conditions keep changing. They became adept at reading situations, at assessing risk, at making quick calculations about trust and reliability, because they'd had to. Because coming home to an empty house at age 8 means learning to evaluate whether that noise is dangerous, whether that stranger is a threat, whether that situation requires adult intervention. You'll have to seek out yourself, and this created a generation comfortable with independence, perhaps too comfortable, perhaps sometimes isolated when they might have benefited from connection, but also capable, also self-sufficient, also able to navigate ambiguity without needing clear direction from authority. The irony they wielded wasn't just defensive posturing, though it was partly that. It was also a sophisticated form of engagement, a way of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, of participating in culture while also critiquing it, of being in the world but not entirely of it. They watched advertising become more sophisticated, watched marketing infiltrate every space, and they developed antibodies, became skeptical consumers, learned to decode the manipulation, and this too would shape how they moved through the world, how they raised their own children, how they evaluated claims and promises. The media literacy they developed, growing up with MTV and cable news and the early internet, served them when information became overwhelming, when everyone had a platform, when truth became contested. They already knew that images could be constructed, that narratives could be shaped, that what you saw on screen wasn't necessarily what was real. Their relationship with technology remained complex. Those who'd grown up with analog and then witnessed digital transformation, who remembered life before the internet, but adapted to life with it. They became translators, able to move between worlds, to explain to older generations while also understanding younger ones. And the friendships they formed, often in the gaps adults left, in the hours after school, before parents came home, in the neighborhoods where they roamed freely. These bonds ran deep, forged in shared experience, in the understanding that comes from facing the world together without constant supervision. The music remained central, the soundtracks they curated for themselves, the mixtapes and later the playlists, the way songs could mark moments, could provide language for feelings that otherwise had no words, and they carried this relationship with music forward, understanding it not as background but as essential. There's something to be said for a generation that expected less, that didn't assume prosperity was birthright, that understood opportunity was limited and competition was real. It created hunger in some, resignation in others, but always awareness, always the knowledge that nothing was guaranteed. They became the middle managers, the ones caught between older executives who didn't understand new technology and younger workers who'd never known the analog world. And they translated, they bridged, they made things work even when the institutional structure didn't quite fit the reality. And when they became parents themselves, many brought different approaches, having experienced divorce, They thought harder about marriage. Having been latchkey kids, they struggled with how much independence to grant. Having absorbed irony, they wondered how to teach sincerity. The inheritance was complicated. The economic recessions they weathered in the early 90s, in 2008, taught them that security was illusion, that savings could vanish, that careers could dead end, and this created a kind of vigilance, a constant scanning for the next crisis, the next disruption, because history had taught them disruption was normal, but there was also creativity, born from constraint, from having to make do, from learning to build something from nothing. The DIY ethic of punk applied to everything. If you wanted something to exist, you created it yourself. You didn't wait for permission or institutional support. And perhaps underneath everything, underneath the skepticism and the independence and the irony, there was also hope, not the naive optimism of those who believed the world would deliver what it promised, but the harder hope of those who knew it wouldn't, who kept going anyway, who found meaning in the effort itself rather than guaranteed outcomes. They learned to hold contradictions, to be both cynical and sincere, both independent and connected, both skeptical of institutions and working within them. And this comfort with paradox, this ability to live in the tension, became a kind of wisdom. The light is changing now, the way it does in late afternoon, when shadows lengthen and everything takes on a golden quality, softer, more forgiving. And looking back across the landscape of this generation, across the decades of their formation and their coming of age, patterns emerge, themes that repeat, threads that connect. There were approximately 60 to 65 million of them in America, born between the mid-1960s and 1980, though the boundaries blur. And they came of age during transformation, economic, technological, social, cultural. They were there for the shift from analog to digital, from Cold War to its aftermath, from manufacturing to service economy, from monoculture to fragmentation. And they adapted. That's perhaps the central story. They adapted to conditions that kept changing, to institutions that proved unreliable, to a social contract that was being rewritten without their input, and they survived it, more than survived. They found ways to thrive, to create, to build lives even when the foundation felt uncertain. The world they inherited was already complicated, already showing cracks, and they learned to navigate complexity, to accept that easy answers were usually wrong, that most situations had multiple valid perspectives, that certainty was often a mask for ignorance. And now, as they move through middle age, as they occupy positions of influence and responsibility, they bring these lessons, this particular wisdom, born from displacement and adaptation. They bring skepticism of grand narratives, preference for practical solutions, comfort with ambiguity, and also perhaps a certain weariness, because it's exhausting, being the generation that expects nothing, that assumes the worst, that always has a backup plan. It's tiring to be perpetually braced for disappointment, to never quite trust that things will work out, and yet this too is their inheritance, this vigilance, this readiness. The younger generations look at them sometimes with confusion, wondering at the irony, the detachment, the reluctance to commit fully to causes or movements, not understanding that this stance was earned, was learned through experience, through watching idealism curdle, through understanding that passion without skepticism can be dangerous. But there's also respect, recognition that this generation held things together during transition, that they managed the shift from one world to another, that they became fluent in multiple languages, analog and digital, sincere and ironic, independent and collaborative, and the story continues because they're not done. The oldest are only in their early 60s now, years ahead still, decades potentially, and what they'll do with those years, how they continue to shape the world, remains unwritten, remains open, a variable still being solved. The music still plays somewhere, those songs from the 80s and 90s, and hearing them brings back not just nostalgia, but something deeper, the feeling of being young in a particular time, of navigating a particular set of circumstances, of becoming who you are through what you endure. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the story of a generation is simply the accumulation of individual stories, of choices made and paths taken, of resilience developed and wisdom earned. There's no grand narrative, no single meaning, just millions of lives lived in proximity, shaped by similar forces, emerging with similar scars and similar strengths. The light continues to fade, the way it does at the end of a long day, and the voices of that generation, the memories they carry, the experiences that shaped them, begin to quiet, to settle into the background, still there, still present, but softer now, more distant. They learn to be comfortable in the quiet, those children who came home to empty houses, who entertained themselves, who figured things out alone, and perhaps that comfort remains, that ability to sit with silence, to not need constant stimulation or validation, to simply be, and in the dimming light, in the space between what was and what will be, their story rests, not finished, never finished while lives continue, but paused for now, held in this moment of reflection, of gentle consideration, of allowing the complexity to simply exist without needing to resolve into simple conclusions. The cassette has stopped spinning. The screen has gone dark. The arcade machines are silent, but the memory remains. The impression left, the shape of a generation carved by circumstance, formed by experience, made by the particular alchemy of time and place and chance, and the night comes softly, as it always does, bringing rest, bringing quiet, bringing the kind of peace that comes not from resolution, but from acceptance, from understanding that some stories don't have endings. They just fade, like voices trailing off, like thoughts dissolving into sleep, like the last light disappearing beyond the horizon, leaving only darkness and stars and the infinite possibility of what comes next. I watch the light change across the land the way it always has, the way it did 10,000 years ago when everything began to shift. The world is quieter here, softer somehow, as though time itself has slowed to the rhythm of growing things, to the patient unfolding of seasons that carry their own ancient knowledge. There are no cities yet, no roads stretching toward distant horizons, only the gentle undulation of the hills and valleys, the slow curve of rivers finding their paths through soil that has never known the plow. But something is stirring, something profound and irrevocable, a transformation so gradual that no single lifetime could perceive its full arc, yet so complete that it would remake the human world entirely. I find myself drawn to the edges of this change, to the threshold between one way of being and another, where the old patterns still hold their shape, but new possibilities whisper in the wind. The grasses here grow tall and wild, their seed heads heavy with potential, swaying in great golden waves that seem to stretch toward every edge of the known world. And in their movement there is something almost hypnotic, something that speaks of abundance and continuity. These are not the grasses of later times, not the orderly rows that will one day march across continents, but their ancestors, the wild progenitors that offer their gifts freely to any creature wise enough to gather them. The air carries scents both familiar and strange. Wood smoke drifting from fires that burn in patterns different from those that came before. The earthy sweetness of grain being ground between stones. The warm mineral smell of clay being shaped by human hands. I notice the way settlements nestle into the landscape, not imposing themselves upon it, but seeming to emerge from it, as though the earth itself had decided to take a new form, to express itself through walls of mud and stone, through roofs of thatch and timber. These structures hold a different quality than the temporary shelters of earlier peoples, a sense of rootedness, of intention that extends beyond the immediate season, beyond the next migration, into a future that had not existed before. The rhythm of days here follows patterns both ancient and revolutionary. The rising sun still marks the beginning of light and warmth. The setting sun still signals the drawing in of darkness. But between these eternal markers, something new is unfolding. I watch figures moving through morning mist, their movements purposeful but unhurried, tending to tasks that their ancestors could not have imagined, coaxing sustenance from the earth itself, participating in cycles they have learned to anticipate, to influence, to shape according to their needs and their growing understanding. There is knowledge here that exists in hands and muscles, in the tilt of a digging stick finding just the right angle, in the pressure of fingers separating grain from chaff, in the careful observation of weather and water and the mysterious ways that seeds become plants, become food, become life itself. The landscape holds evidence of this knowledge, small plots where the earth has been loosened and turned, where certain plants grow in concentrations that nature alone would not create, where human intention and natural process have begun their long conversation, and yet the wild world remains close, vast and present, providing much of what these people need, offering the meat of deer and aurochs, the flesh of fish from rivers and streams, the gathered roots and fruits and nuts that still make up so much of their sustenance. This is a world of careful balance, of holding multiple ways of living in a kind of dynamic tension, neither fully one thing nor another, but existing in that fertile space between where possibilities multiply and branch like the rivers spreading across alluvial plains. I feel the weight of what is happening here, the magnitude of this turning point that will echo forward through all the centuries to come, though those who live within it cannot know the full extent of what they are beginning. They are simply solving problems, finding ways to feed their families through the lean months, discovering that certain actions lead to certain outcomes, that seeds saved and planted will grow, that some animals can be kept close and bred, that clay hardens in fire and becomes something entirely new. Each small innovation carries within it the seed of transformation. Each success builds upon the last, creating a momentum that will eventually become unstoppable, though for now it moves with the slowness of geological time, with the patience of mountains being worn down by rain. The evening draws near, and the quality of the light begins to soften, casting long shadows across fields and settlements, touching everything with amber and gold. I turn my attention backward, to the time before this time, to the world as it existed when ice still covered much of the northern lands, when the great herds moved in their ancient patterns, and humans moved with them. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived as wanderers, following the rhythms of animals and seasons, carrying everything they owned on their backs or in their hands, leaving little trace of their passing beyond the scattered bones of meals and the worked flint of their tools. They were not primitive in their thinking, not simple in their understanding of the world, but their relationship to the land was one of movement, of taking what nature provided in its own time, of reading the signs that told them when to move and where to find abundance. The last great ice age held the world in its grip for tens of thousands of years, shaping the land with glaciers that ground mountains into valleys, that locked vast quantities of water away in frozen sheets miles thick, that pushed life into the warmer regions where survival remained possible. But ice ages do not last forever, and around 15,000 years ago, the climate began its long, slow shift toward warmth, the glaciers retreating, the sea levels rising, the land responding with changes that rippled across every ecosystem. As the ice withdrew, new landscapes emerged. Forests spread across lands that had been tundra. Grasslands expanded into territories once locked beneath frozen water, and the flora and fauna reorganized themselves into new configurations, new possibilities. In a region that would later be called the Fertile Crescent, a great arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria and down into the Levant, the conditions aligned in ways both fortunate and transformative. This was a land blessed with wild cereals, ancestors of wheat and barley that grew in dense stands across hillsides and valleys, their nutritious seeds offering sustenance to any who knew how to gather and process them, and the people here had been doing exactly that for millennia. The Natufian culture, flourishing around 12,500 years ago, had already begun to experiment with something radical. They were staying in place, building permanent settlements of circular stone houses, creating communities that existed in one location year after year. They still hunted gazelle and deer, still gathered wild plants in their seasons, but they had discovered that the wild grain fields nearby were productive enough, reliable enough, to support a different way of living, one that did not require constant movement across the landscape. Their villages held perhaps a few dozen people, maybe 100 or more in the larger settlements, and they developed tools specifically for harvesting and processing grain, sickle blades made from flint, grinding stones for turning seeds into flour, storage pits for keeping food beyond the harvest season. But they had not yet crossed the threshold into true agriculture. They were intensive gatherers, experts at exploiting wild resources, living in that transitional space between the old ways and what was to come. Then the climate shifted again. Around 10,800 years ago, a period called the Younger Dryas brought a return to colder, drier conditions, lasting for more than 1,000 years, and the wild grain fields that had supported sedentary life began to fail. Some groups returned to full nomadism, following the old patterns of movement, but others faced a different choice. They had built homes, established communities, created social bonds tied to specific places, and they were reluctant to abandon what they had made. It was in this crucible of necessity, in this narrowing of options, that some groups began to actively cultivate the plants they depended upon to save seeds from the best specimens and plant them deliberately, to clear ground and protect growing areas, to cross the invisible line into agriculture. The transition was not sudden, not a single moment of invention, but a gradual accumulation of practices and knowledge, a slow dance between human need and plant biology, each influencing the other across generations. The earliest cultivated wheat appears in the archaeological record around 10,500 years ago at sites like Abu Huraira in Syria and Netiv Hagdud in the Jordan Valley, alongside evidence of stored grain and purpose-built structures for processing. These early farmers were still experimenting, still maintaining their hunting and gathering practices alongside the new techniques, hedging their bets against failure, living in multiple worlds simultaneously. The plants themselves began to change under human selection. Domestication leaves its marks in morphology and genetics, in ways that archaeologists can read like text. And the story they tell is one of co-evolution, of mutual transformation. Wild wheat and barley have brittle rachis, the part of the seed head that shatters easily, scattering seeds across the ground for natural dispersal. But this makes harvesting difficult. The seeds fall and are lost before they can be gathered. Farmers, whether consciously or not, selected for mutant plants with tougher rachis, ones that held their seeds, making harvest more efficient, and over generations these mutants became dominant in cultivated fields, creating plants that could no longer effectively spread their own seeds, that depended on human hands for reproduction. Similarly, seed size increased as farmers preferentially saved and planted the largest grains, creating cereals more productive and nutritious than their wild ancestors, but also more dependent on cultivation, on the care and intention of their human partners. Barley was among the first to be domesticated, its tolerance for varied conditions making it adaptable, followed closely by einkorn and emmer wheat, each with its own characteristics, its own advantages for different soils and climates. Lentils and peas joined the agricultural repertoire early, their protein-rich seeds complementing the grains, providing nutritional balance, and their ability to fix nitrogen in the soil, improving the fertility of fields where they were grown. By 9,500 years ago, the practice had spread across the Fertile Crescent. Dozens of settlements engaged in cultivation, sharing knowledge, trading seeds, developing regional variations on the fundamental theme. Jericho in the Jordan Valley grew into one of the earliest true towns, its population swelling to perhaps 3,000 people, protected by massive stone walls and a tower that still stands in ruined form, evidence of organized labor and social complexity beyond anything seen before. Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey would later become even larger, a densely packed settlement of perhaps 8,000 souls, their houses built wall to wall, entered through roof hatches, decorated with elaborate murals and sculptures, a community of unprecedented scale and sophistication. But agriculture alone did not create these changes. Another transformation was happening simultaneously, one that would prove equally revolutionary in its effects. People had long held relationships with certain animals. Dogs had been domesticated thousands of years earlier, companions in the hunt, guardians of camps. But now other species were being drawn into the human orbit. Wild sheep and goats roamed the hills of the Fertile Crescent, relatively docile compared to other prey, their herding behavior making them easier to manage. And around the same time that plant cultivation began, some communities started keeping these animals in captivity. The earliest evidence of sheep domestication appears around 10,000 years ago in the Zagros Mountains of modern Iran, where changes in the age and sex ratios of sheep bones suggest managed herds rather than wild hunting. Goats followed quickly, perhaps domesticated independently in multiple locations, their adaptability to rough terrain and varied vegetation making them ideal for the mixed landscapes where early farming communities established themselves. These animals provided meat, obviously, but also milk once they were bred for docility and milk production, and wool from sheep that were selected for fleece rather than hair, and horn and bone for tools, and dung for fuel and fertilizer. Cattle came later, around 8,000 years ago, domesticated from the fierce aurochs that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder, a more dangerous and difficult animal to bring under control, but one that offered immense rewards in size and strength. Pigs were domesticated in multiple regions around the same time, their omnivorous diet allowing them to thrive on scraps and waste, converting unusable material into meat, filling a particular niche in the emerging agricultural ecosystem. Each domestication was its own epic, its own multi-generational story of observation and selection, of humans and animals learning to live together in new configurations, creating relationships of mutual dependence that would shape both species profoundly. The animals changed under domestication, becoming smaller, more docile, more variable in color and form than their wild ancestors, their skulls and teeth and bones reflecting the pressures of human selection and the different conditions of captive life. And humans changed too, their societies reorganizing around the demands of cultivation and herding, their calendars marked by planting and harvest, their settlements growing larger and more permanent, their social structures becoming more complex to manage the new forms of wealth and labor. By 8,000 years ago, the Neolithic transformation was in full flower across the Fertile Crescent. Hundreds of farming villages dotting the landscape, their fields spreading across valleys and up hillsides, their herds moving in managed patterns between seasonal pastures. The knowledge that had emerged in the Fertile Crescent did not remain contained within its borders. It flowed outward like water finding new channels, carried by migrants and traders, by the simple human tendency to share useful innovations, by the inexorable logic of population, pressure-seeking new lands. Into Anatolia it spread, across the high plateau where volcanic soils and winter rains created conditions favorable for wheat and barley, where communities built houses of mud brick and timber, where they plastered their walls and painted them with geometric patterns and stylized figures. Southward into the Nile Valley, though there the transformation took a different form, the annual flooding of the great river creating its own rhythms and possibilities, the rich silt deposits eliminating the need for fallowing, allowing continuous cultivation in ways the rain-fed fields of the Levant could not match. Westward into Anatolia and beyond, the agricultural package moving across the Mediterranean basin, adapted to new climates and soils, modified to incorporate local wild species, transformed by each culture that adopted it into something slightly different, slightly local. By 7,000 years ago, farming communities had appeared in Greece, on Cyprus, along the coasts of the Aegean, their pottery and tools showing clear connections to the Near Eastern traditions from which they descended, but already developing regional characteristics. Local innovations. The movement into Europe took multiple paths. A coastal route following the Mediterranean shoreline, carrying the farming complex into Italy and southern France and the Iberian Peninsula, settlements appearing like stepping stones, each one a foundation for the next wave of expansion, and a continental route pushing up the river valleys of the Danube and the Rhine, through the fertile loess soils of Central Europe, bringing agriculture into lands that had known only foragers, into forests dense and dark and rich with game. The linear band ceramic culture, named for the distinctive linear decorations on their pottery, spread across Central Europe between 7,000 and 6,500 years ago, their longhouses stretching sometimes more than 100 feet in length, sheltering extended families and their animals under single massive roofs. These communities established themselves in clearings along rivers, felling trees with stone axes, burning the slash to create fields, planting their wheat and barley and peas in soil enriched by ash. Moving on after a generation or two when yields declined, leaving the forest to reclaim what they had taken, they brought cattle and sheep and goats, but also incorporated the hunting of red deer and wild boar, fishing in the rivers, gathering hazelnuts and wild fruits, creating a mixed economy that drew from both the agricultural toolkit and the abundant wild resources of the European landscape. The pottery they made was more than functional. It was beautiful, decorated with intricate curvilinear patterns that must have held meaning we can no longer read, each vessel a canvas for expression, for identity, for the marking of cultural boundaries and connections. Their settlements show evidence of violence sometimes, ditches and palisades suggesting defense was necessary, mass graves with marks of trauma speaking to conflicts we cannot fully understand, competition for land perhaps, or resources, or simply the friction of different groups coming into contact. But there was also trade, obsidian from Hungary appearing hundreds of miles away, spondylus shells from the Mediterranean traveling inland, creating networks of exchange that connected communities across vast distances, that facilitated the flow not just of goods, but of ideas and techniques and innovations. To the north and west, the Atlantic coast of Europe saw a different kind of Neolithic, one where the domesticated plants and animals were adopted, but combined with continued heavy reliance on marine resources, where fishing and shellfishing remained central to survival and identity. The megalith builders of this Atlantic Neolithic created some of the most enduring monuments of the entire era, massive stone tombs and ceremonial structures that required coordinated labor on an impressive scale, that speak to sophisticated social organization and spiritual beliefs. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 5,000 years ago, its passage tomb aligned to capture the light of the winter solstice sunrise, illuminating the inner chamber in a moment of precise astronomical coordination, showing knowledge and intention and a conception of time that stretched beyond individual lives. Karnak in Brittany, where thousands of standing stones march across the landscape in long parallel rows, their purpose debated, their impact undeniable, a transformation of the land into something simultaneously functional and symbolic, practical and sacred. These monuments required not just labor, but surplus, the ability to feed workers who were not producing food, which meant agricultural productivity had reached levels that could support specialization, that could create time and energy for pursuits beyond immediate subsistence. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, independent agricultural revolutions were unfolding, each one a separate experiment in the same fundamental transformation, each one proof that humans everywhere were capable of this leap when conditions aligned. In China, rice and millet were being domesticated in different regions around 9,000 years ago. The rice in the Yangtze River Valley, the millet in the Yellow River Valley, creating distinct agricultural traditions that would eventually merge and spread. The rice farmers developed sophisticated water management, learning to flood fields deliberately, to manipulate the landscape to create the conditions their crop required, transforming valleys into intricate mosaics of paddies and channels. Pigs and chickens were domesticated in China, adding to the agricultural repertoire, creating farming systems adapted to the specific ecology and climate of East Asia, different from the Near Eastern model, but achieving similar ends through different means. In Mesoamerica, maize was being developed from a wild grass called teosinte, a transformation so profound that for years scientists could not believe the two plants were related, the tiny seed head of the ancestor becoming the large cob of the descendant through millennia of selection. Squash and beans joined maize in the agricultural trinity of the Americas. The three sisters, as they would later be called, planted together in a mutually beneficial relationship, the beans fixing nitrogen, the squash shading the ground, the maize providing a structure for the beans to climb. This happened gradually, over thousands of years, the earliest evidence of cultivation appearing around 9,000 years ago, but full dependence on agriculture not emerging until much later, the transition drawn out, tentative, reversible for long periods. In the Andes, potatoes were domesticated from wild species growing at high altitudes, along with quinoa and other crops adapted to the thin air and cold nights of mountain agriculture, creating food systems that could support dense populations in environments that seemed inhospitable. Llamas and alpacas, the only large domesticated animals of the Americas, provided transport and fiber and occasionally meat, though never the pulling power of cattle or horses, never the same potential for intensive agriculture that draft animals enabled in the Old World. In Africa, south of the Sahara, sorghum and pearl millet were domesticated in the Sahel region, along with African rice in the Niger Delta, yams in West Africa, teff in the Ethiopian highlands, each region developing crops suited to local conditions, to local needs and preferences. The spread of agriculture in Africa was complicated by the presence of tsetse flies in humid regions, making it difficult to keep cattle in vast areas, by different rainfall patterns, by the north-south orientation of the continent that meant crops had to cross climate zones rather than spreading along similar latitudes, but spread it did, agriculture eventually reaching most of Africa, transforming societies, enabling population growth, creating the foundation for the kingdoms and empires that would rise in later millennia. Back in the Near East and Europe, the Middle Neolithic saw continued innovation and elaboration. Pottery became more sophisticated, kiln technology improving, forms diversifying, decoration becoming more complex and regionally distinctive. Metallurgy emerged, first with copper worked cold like stone, then heated and annealed to improve its properties, eventually smelted from ore around 7,000 years ago in the Near East, opening entirely new possibilities for tools and ornaments and weapons. Copper axes could hold an edge better than stone. Copper awls could pierce leather more easily. Copper ornaments could be cast in forms impossible with other materials. Though stone tools remained dominant for most purposes, copper being too soft for many applications and too rare to replace the lithic technology that had served humans for hundreds of thousands of years, the plow was invented, or perhaps discovered is more accurate. Someone realizing that a modified digging stick pulled by an animal could break ground more efficiently than human muscle alone, transforming agriculture from a labor-intensive garden cultivation to something approaching field agriculture. This happened around 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Simple ORD plows scratching furrows in the soil, not turning it over like later moldboard plows would, but still a revolutionary increase in the amount of land a single family could cultivate. With plows came a shift toward male-dominated field labor, the heavy work of controlling animals and guiding plows becoming associated with men in many cultures, while women continued to manage household gardens and processing and storage, creating gender divisions of labor that had not existed in the same form among foragers. The wheel appeared around 5,500 years ago, first for pottery, the potter's wheel allowing new forms and greater speed of production, then adapted for transport, solid wooden wheels fixed to axles, pulled by oxen, moving goods in quantities previously impossible. Irrigation developed in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, channels dug to bring water to fields beyond the reach of natural flooding, allowing cultivation of larger areas, but also requiring coordination and maintenance, creating the need for more complex social organization. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, the first urban centers emerging in Sumer around 5,500 years ago. Uruk swelling to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, an unprecedented concentration of humanity, requiring new forms of governance and economic organization. Writing emerged from the accounting needs of these early cities. Tokens and seals giving way to impressed clay tablets. Pictographs representing goods and quantities, gradually evolving into cuneiform script that could represent speech itself, that could preserve knowledge and contracts and stories across time. The transformation that writing represented cannot be overstated. For the first time in human history, knowledge could be preserved exactly, transmitted across generations without the distortions of oral tradition, accumulated in libraries and archives, creating an external memory that exceeded the capacity of any individual mind. But writing was a tool of the elite initially, scribes trained in specialized schools, their skills serving the needs of temples and palaces, recording tribute and tax, inventories and contracts, the administrative apparatus of increasingly complex societies. The Neolithic had by this point, around 5,000 years ago, fully transitioned into something else in the most developed regions, into what archaeologists call the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, and in some places into the early Bronze Age, as tin was alloyed with copper to create a harder, more versatile metal. Yet vast areas of the world remained fully Neolithic in their technology and economy. The transition to metalworking spreading unevenly, determined by access to ore deposits and trade networks, by cultural preferences and economic systems, by the particular trajectory of each society. In Britain, the Neolithic persisted until around 4,000 years ago. Communities still using primarily stone tools, still building in timber and earth rather than mud brick and stone, still organizing their societies around kinship and clan rather than the urban hierarchies emerging in the Near East. Stonehenge rose in stages across this British Neolithic, beginning around 5,000 years ago with a simple circular earthwork, evolving over centuries into the massive stone circle whose ruins still stand, each phase representing enormous investments of labor, requiring coordination across multiple communities. Speaking to belief systems and social structures we can only glimpse through archaeology. The bluestones transported from Wales, some 150 miles away, carried or dragged or floated on rafts, their movement a feat of organization and determination, and the sarsen stones from closer quarries, each weighing 25 tons or more, shaped with stone hammers into precise forms, erected into linteled circles that encoded astronomical alignments. What drove such efforts? Such devotion of resources to monuments that produced no food, no shelter, no immediate material benefit, can only be understood through the lens of meaning and identity, through the human need for connection to ancestors and cosmos, for marking the land as culturally significant, as home. In Northern Europe, the late Neolithic saw the emergence of new pottery traditions, the corded ware culture spreading across a vast region from the Rhine to the Volga, their distinctive vessels decorated with impressions from twisted cord, their burial practices including individual graves with specific gender-associated goods, battle axes for men, amber ornaments for women, and the bell beaker culture appearing around 4,600 years ago, their characteristic drinking vessels found across Western and Central Europe, from Britain to Sicily, from Portugal to Hungary, suggesting far-flung networks of exchange and possibly migration, possibly the spread of a particular social identity or belief system. These late Neolithic cultures existed at the threshold of the Bronze Age, some groups already working metal, others still fully stone-using, the boundaries between periods blurred and overlapping, the transformation happening at different rates in different places. Trade became increasingly important. Amber from the Baltic, obsidian from Anatolia, jade from the Alps, tin from Cornwall and Brittany, each material moving along routes that connected distant communities, creating dependencies and relationships that transcended local economies. With trade came the possibility of wealth accumulation, some individuals or families controlling access to valued goods, using trade connections to enhance their status, beginning the process of social differentiation that would lead to hereditary inequality, to chiefs and commoners, to the hierarchical societies that would characterize later ages. The late Neolithic also saw increased evidence of conflict, fortified settlements becoming more common, weapons more prevalent in burials, mass graves with trauma indicating warfare, suggesting that competition for resources and territory intensified as populations grew and prime agricultural land became scarce, the lake dwellings of alpine Europe, built on platforms over water, partially reflect this need for defensible positions, though they also took advantage of lacustrine resources, fish and waterfowl, reeds for thatch and weaving, the particular affordances of wetland environments. These settlements preserve organic materials that normally decay, wooden tools and textiles, basketry and rope, leather and plant remains, offering glimpses of the full material culture that is usually lost, showing the sophistication and skill of Neolithic craftspeople in perishable media, the textiles especially, woven on simple looms from flax and wool, demonstrate aesthetic sensibilities and technical competence. Cloth of different weights and weaves, some plain, some with patterns created through variation in thread color or weaving technique, garments tailored to fit, decorated with embroidery or applique. Food processing had become highly developed, grinding stones of various types for different grains, sieves for separating flour from bran, fermentation of grain into beer, milk into cheese and yogurt, transforming raw materials into more digestible, more storable, more varied forms. The cuisine of the late Neolithic was not simple or monotonous. Archaeological evidence and experimental archaeology suggest bread of various types, porridges and gruels, stews combining meat and vegetables and grain, dairy products, both fresh and preserved, fruits fresh and dried, honey for sweetening, herbs for flavor and medicine. Meals were social events, families gathering around hearths, communities feasting on special occasions, the sharing of food reinforcing bonds and obligations, creating the social fabric that held settlements together, that maintained cooperation in the face of individual self-interest. Houses themselves had evolved from the simple circular or oval structures of the early Neolithic, in many regions becoming larger, more rectangular, divided into rooms with specialized functions, storage areas separate from living areas, workspaces distinct from sleeping quarters. Some late Neolithic houses show evidence of second stories, sleeping lofts, or storage areas above the main floor, making more efficient use of space, accommodating growing families within existing settlements rather than always expanding outward. The construction techniques had grown sophisticated, timber framing with wattle and daub infill, thatched roofs carefully laid to shed water, plastered walls painted white or in colors, floors of packed earth or clay or sometimes wood planks. Each culture developing its own architectural tradition adapted to local materials and climate. In the Near East and Anatolia, mud brick remained the primary building material, walls thick enough to insulate against summer heat and winter cold, flat roofs that could serve as additional living space in warm weather, courtyards that brought light and air into the center of tightly packed settlements. The late Neolithic saw the full development of the domestic sphere as a distinct cultural realm. Households as economic units, as centers of production and consumption, as the basic building blocks of community organization, the foundation upon which all larger social structures rested. Religion had become increasingly institutionalized, shrines and temples built for communal ritual, priesthoods emerging as specialized roles, religious practice moving beyond household and clan to become a focus of settlement-wide identity and coordination. The great temples of Malta, built between 5,800 and 4,000 years ago, massive stone structures with elaborate facades and interior chambers, decorated with spiral carvings and representational art, demonstrate the capacity of Neolithic communities to organize labor for religious purposes, to create lasting monuments to their beliefs. Female figurines, common throughout the Neolithic, suggest the importance of fertility and regeneration in religious thought, though interpretation remains contested. Some seeing goddess worship, others seeing generic symbols of abundance, others cautioning against imposing modern categories on ancient beliefs. Burial practices grew more elaborate, particularly for certain individuals, suggesting emerging social hierarchies. Though the late Neolithic generally remained more egalitarian than the Bronze Age societies that would follow, wealth differences visible but not yet crystallized into permanent class divisions. Secondary burial became common in some cultures, bodies allowed to decay, then bones gathered and reburied collectively, creating a connection between living and dead that emphasized community continuity, lineage, and belonging extending beyond individual lives into the realm of ancestors. Around 4,000 years ago, across so much of the Old World, the Neolithic began its final transition into the Bronze Age proper, though this was less a sharp break than a gradual shift, bronze tools and weapons slowly replacing stone, urban centers growing larger and more complex, writing spreading beyond the earliest centers, long-distance trade intensifying. But in defining what the Neolithic was, it is not the endpoint that matters most. It is the entirety of the transformation, the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge and practice that remade human life, that created the foundation for everything that followed. For thousands of years, humans had domesticated plants and animals, had settled into permanent communities, had developed pottery and weaving and complex tool kits, had built monuments and elaborated rituals, had increased their numbers from millions to tens of millions across the globe. They had changed the landscape profoundly, clearing forests, creating fields, building settlements, diverting water, their presence visible from a distance in ways forager camps never were, the earth itself bearing the marks of human intention and labor. And they had changed themselves, their bodies adapting to new diets, developing lactose tolerance in populations that herded dairy animals, changing in stature and robustness as nutrition and disease patterns shifted, their brains reorganized by literacy in the places where writing emerged. The pace of change had accelerated beyond anything evolution had prepared humans for, biological adaptation proceeding on timescales of thousands of generations, cultural evolution now happening within single lifetimes, the gap between the two creating tensions and mismatches that persist to the present day. The Neolithic was not just a technological revolution, though it was certainly that. It was a revolution in human consciousness, in the way people understood their place in the world, in their relationship to time itself before agriculture. Human planning horizons extended perhaps a season, maybe a year, decisions made in response to immediate conditions, movements timed to the predictable migrations of animals and the ripening of wild plants. A life lived in the eternal present of ecological rhythms. But farming required forethought on an entirely different scale. Seeds saved from one harvest would not yield food until the next year. Decisions about where to plant and what to plant committed land and labor months in advance. Investments in clearing and soil preparation that might not pay off for years. This extended temporal awareness, this need to imagine future states and work toward them systematically, fundamentally altered human cognition, creating minds that could plan, that could delay gratification, that could coordinate complex sequences of action toward distant goals. The psychological impact of this shift ripples through every aspect of Neolithic life, visible in the monuments that required generations to complete, in the burial practices that emphasized lineage and continuity, in the development of property concepts tied to specific places, to fields and orchards that represented accumulated labor across time. Ownership itself took on new meaning when a family invested years in improving a plot of land, clearing stones, amending soil, planting fruit trees that would not bear for years. That land became identified with them in ways that hunting territories never had. It became inheritance, something to pass to children, something worth defending. And with ownership came anxiety, the fear of loss that haunts all agricultural peoples, the knowledge that a bad season could mean starvation, that pests or disease could destroy months of work in days, that conflict could dispossess a family of everything they had built. This anxiety drove innovation, the development of storage techniques to buffer against shortage, the formation of alliances and exchange networks to provide insurance, the elaboration of religious practices seeking to influence the forces that controlled fertility and weather, attempts to impose order on a world that remained fundamentally uncertain, the relationship to nature transformed. Foragers lived within ecosystems, taking what was offered, moving on when local resources declined, their impact real but diffuse, their presence part of the natural balance rather than a force disrupting it. Farmers worked against natural succession, clearing land and keeping it clear, preventing the return of forest, creating and maintaining artificial ecosystems that existed only through constant labor, imposing human will on the landscape in an ongoing struggle against entropy. This was not harmony with nature, though it was not yet the wholesale domination that would come with industrialization. It was negotiation, collaboration, a relationship both creative and extractive, building soil fertility while depleting it, protecting favored species while eliminating competitors, shaping nature while being shaped by its constraints. The plants and animals of the Neolithic became something between wild and artifice, domesticates that could not survive without human care, that existed in forms nature alone would never have created, yet still living things with their own needs and tendencies, partners rather than products, though the line between partnership and exploitation was always blurred. In the quiet of evening, when the work was done and fires burned low, Neolithic people must have contemplated the strangeness of their lives, the way they had bound themselves to place and plant, the way their ancestors' way of life had slipped away like water through cupped hands. Did they recognize the magnitude of what was happening? Did they see themselves as revolutionaries? Or did it all feel inevitable, each small change leading naturally to the next, the pattern only visible in retrospect from the vantage point of those who would come after? The stories they told are lost, their songs silent, their fears and hopes and dreams accessible only through the mute testimony of objects and structures, through the patterns archaeologists discern in the scatter of ancient seeds and the layout of vanished villages. But we can imagine must imagine the interior lives of these people who are as human as we are, who loved and grieved, who watched their children grow and worried for their futures, who found meaning in their work and their communities, who created beauty not from necessity but from the sheer human need to make meaning. The decorated pottery, the carved figurines, the painted walls and elaborate burials all speak to this need, to the impulse to transform the material world into something more than functional, to embed it with significance, to make it reflect the inner landscape of thought and feeling, and in doing so, in creating permanence and investing place with meaning, in building structures that would outlast individual lives. They were also creating history, creating a record that could be read, creating the possibility of connection across time. The light shifts again, as it always does, as it did in that ancient world, and as it does now, the long arc of the day bending toward evening, toward the soft dissolution of forms into shadow. I find myself standing at the edge of all those vanished fields, all those settlements that have returned to earth, trying to feel the weight of what happened here, the slow, patient work of 10,000 years of human hands shaping the world. The wind moves through grasses that may or may not be descended from those first cultivated stands. The distinction between wild and domestic long since blurred by millennia of cross-pollination and selection, by the constant exchange between human intention and natural process. Somewhere beneath my feet, if I could dig deep enough past the accumulated sediments of centuries, I might find a grinding stone, a flint blade, a shard of pottery whose maker has been dust for 5,000 years, each object a point of contact with lives fully lived and completely vanished. The Neolithic left us more than artifacts. It left us the fundamental structure of human civilization, the agricultural foundation on which everything else was built, the sedentary lifestyle that made cities possible, the surplus production that freed some people to specialize, to create art and architecture and eventually literature and science. Every loaf of bread, every domestic animal, every woven cloth, every brick building, every concept of property and inheritance and settlement traces its lineage back to those first tentative experiments in the Fertile Crescent and the other centers of agricultural origin. We are still, in many ways, Neolithic people, our bodies and brains shaped by the 10,000 years of agricultural life more than by the brief industrial centuries. Our deepest instincts about family and territory and resource management forged in that long transformation, the anxieties that haunt modern life, the fear of scarcity, the drive to accumulate and pass on, the tendency to see nature as something to be managed rather than joined. These, too, are inheritances from the Neolithic, psychological adaptations to a way of life that created new opportunities and new terrors in equal measure. But so, too, is the capacity for patience, for long-term planning, for cooperation on scales beyond the immediate band, for creating beauty and meaning in everyday objects, for imagining futures and working toward them, for binding ourselves to place and community with ties that transcend individual survival. The evening deepens, stars beginning to appear in the darkening vault above. The same stars that guided Neolithic farmers in their planting, that marked the seasons in their endless turning, that connected earth to cosmos in patterns both useful and sacred. I think of all the seeds planted and harvested across all those generations, each one a small act of faith, a belief that the future would come, that work done today would yield returns tomorrow or next season or next year, that the world would continue in its patterns, that children would inherit what parents had built. And mostly they did. Mostly the rains came and the seeds sprouted and the animals bred and the children grew. Not always, not without loss and grief and failure, but enough to sustain the experiment, enough to carry it forward into the next generation and the next, until it became not an experiment, but simply the way things were, the only way anyone could remember. The old wandering life, a story told by grandparents who heard it from their grandparents, a legend of a time before time when people moved with the animals and lived by the gifts of the wild earth. The Neolithic is over now, long over, succeeded by bronze and iron, by empires and religions, by technologies and transformations those first farmers could never have imagined. Yet it remains present in every bite we eat, every roof over our heads, every settlement from village to metropolis. It is the foundation, the bedrock, the deep past that made the present possible. And in quiet moments, when the modern world falls away and we find ourselves standing in evening light, watching the land settle into shadow, we might still feel its presence, still sense the slow, patient work of those ancient hands in every cultivated field, every domestic creature, every human dwelling on the face of the earth. The darkness gathers gently, softly, without urgency, and the Neolithic world fades into the long dream of history, its people gone, but not entirely lost, living on in us, in the fundamental patterns of our lives, in the deep structures of civilization, in the seeds we still plant each spring, hoping for harvest, trusting in continuity, believing in the future they first learned to imagine so long ago. The stars wheel overhead, patient and eternal, marking time as they always have, as they did for the first person who ever deliberately placed a seed in the earth and waited. And we are all the children of that waiting, that faith, that quiet revolution that changed everything, and the world settles into stillness, into the peace of completion, into the gentle fade of all stories told, all transformations remembered, all the quiet work of human hands across the ages, finding rest at last in memory, in the soft dark, in the endless turning of seasons that continues still, continues always, continues. The world is made of things we cannot see, and yet they shape everything. In the depths of matter, beneath the surface of atoms, below the familiar realm of molecules and cells, there exists a place where the very fabric of reality becomes something else entirely, something strange and beautiful, a realm so small that light itself becomes a clumsy tool for observation, a domain where particles dance in patterns that defy the everyday logic we carry through our waking hours. Tonight, we descend into that hidden architecture, the quantum world where the fundamental pieces of existence reveal themselves, not as solid objects, but as fleeting probabilities, as whispers of energy, as moments of interaction that build the universe from the ground up. This is the realm of particle physics, a landscape populated by entities with curious names, quarks and leptons, bosons and fermions, each one a thread in the tapestry of everything, each one governed by forces that operate beyond our direct perception, and yet these invisible actors perform on a stage that determines the color of stars, the weight of atoms, the very possibility of matter itself. Imagine standing at the edge of understanding, where human curiosity meets the limits of the very small, where questions about the nature of reality require instruments larger than cathedrals, where the search for answers has consumed generations of minds, each one adding a piece to an ever-expanding puzzle. The story of particle physics is not simply a catalog of discoveries. It is a journey into increasingly subtle layers of existence, a gradual unveiling that began when ancient philosophers first wondered whether matter could be divided infinitely, or whether there existed some final, irreducible grain of substance, some fundamental unit beyond which nothing smaller could be found. For centuries, that question remained purely philosophical, a thought experiment conducted in the mind, without instruments, without mathematics precise enough to capture such minute scales. But as human understanding deepened, as tools became more refined, the question transformed from abstract speculation into something that could be tested, measured, answered through careful observation and brilliant reasoning. The particles we now know, the building blocks that construct protons and neutrons, the force carriers that mediate interactions, the elusive neutrinos that pass through entire planets without notice, these were once beyond imagination, unthinkable, and yet, through patience and ingenuity, they emerge from a shadow into the light of knowledge. There is something profoundly calming about contemplating these depths, about recognizing that beneath the complexity of daily experience, beneath the intricate machinery of biology and chemistry, there lies a simpler, more elegant set of rules, a handful of particles, a few fundamental forces, all interacting according to principles that can be written in equations, understood through symmetry, predicted with extraordinary precision. In this hidden world, time behaves strangely. Particles appear and vanish in fractions of a second, so brief that ordinary language struggles to contain them. Interactions occur across distances measured in femtometers, a scale so small that a million of them would barely span the width of a single human hair. And yet, within these infinitesimal domains, the character of everything is determined. The narrative we are about to explore unfolds slowly across decades and continents, through the work of thousands of researchers, each one contributing observations, theories, refinements to an ever-growing understanding. It is a story without a single hero, but rather a collective human endeavor, a conversation across time, where each generation builds upon the insights of those who came before. We will wander through this landscape gently, examining the particles themselves, the forces that bind them, the symmetries that govern their behavior, the experimental apparatus designed to reveal them, and the theoretical frameworks that predict their properties with astonishing accuracy. We will trace the emergence of this knowledge, not as a triumphant march, but as a patient accumulation of understanding, moment by moment, discovery by discovery. And as we move deeper, we will find that particle physics is not merely a technical discipline, but a meditation on existence itself, a way of asking what it means for something to be real, to be fundamental, to be necessary rather than contingent. These questions echo in the quiet spaces between particles, in the symmetries that seem almost too perfect to be accidental, in the mathematical beauty that emerges when nature is observed at its most basic level, so we begin at the threshold, where the visible world gives way to the invisible, where matter dissolves into energy and energy crystallizes into matter, where the dance of particles creates everything we know and everything we have yet to discover. The journey begins, as so many great journeys do, with the simple act of questioning what seems obvious. For most of human history, matter appeared solid, dependable, continuous. A stone was a stone. Water was water. And the idea that these substances might be composed of smaller, invisible units seemed either obvious or absurd, depending on the century and the culture asking the question. The ancient Greeks debated this puzzle with remarkable sophistication. Around 400 years before the Common Era, a philosopher named Democritus proposed that all matter consisted of tiny, indivisible particles he called atoms, from the Greek word atomos, meaning uncuttable. He imagined these atoms as eternal, indestructible, differing only in shape and size, tumbling through empty space, combining and separating to create the rich variety of substances we observe. It was a beautiful idea, born entirely from reasoning rather than experiment, and for nearly 2,000 years it remained just that, an elegant thought with no way to test its validity. Other philosophers disagreed, Aristotle among them, arguing that matter was infinitely divisible, that the notion of empty space made no sense, that the world consisted of continuous substances governed by qualities rather than discrete particles. His view dominated Western thought for centuries, not because it was proven, but because it aligned with the intuitions of experience, and because Aristotle's influence was so profound that questioning him seemed almost heretical. But ideas have a way of returning, especially when they resonate with something true about the nature of things. By the 17th century, as experimental methods began to replace pure philosophy, the atomic hypothesis started to acquire new life. Chemists noticed patterns in how substances combined. They observed that elements seemed to join in definite proportions, not in arbitrary amounts, as if some underlying discreteness governed their interactions. John Dalton, working in the early 1800s, revived the atomic theory with empirical support. He proposed that each element consisted of identical atoms, unique to that element, and that chemical reactions were simply rearrangements of these atoms into new configurations. His theory explained the observed ratios in chemical combinations, and though his atoms were still hypothetical, invisible to any instrument of the time, the explanatory power of the idea began to win converts. Still, many remained skeptical. The atom was, at this stage, more of a useful fiction than an established reality, a convenient accounting device that helped chemists keep track of reactions, but not necessarily a description of actual physical entities. The 19th century brought deeper mysteries. Physicists studying electricity discovered that it seemed to flow in discrete units. Michael Faraday's experiments with electrolysis revealed that charge itself appeared quantized, coming in fundamental portions rather than as a continuous fluid. This was peculiar, suggestive, a hint that perhaps the ancient intuition about discreteness in nature had merit after all. Then came the discovery that would crack open the atom itself, revealing it not as the final indivisible unit Democritus had imagined, but as a complex structure, a miniature cosmos with its own architecture. In 1897, J.J. Thomson, working at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, performed experiments with cathode rays, mysterious emanations that appeared when electrical current passed through evacuated glass tubes. By subjecting these rays to magnetic and electric fields, Thomson demonstrated that they consisted of particles, each carrying a negative charge, and each possessing a mass far smaller than even the lightest atom. He had discovered the electron, the first subatomic particle, the first proof that atoms were not indivisible after all, but contained smaller constituents. This was a threshold moment, a crossing from one understanding of matter to another. If atoms contained electrons, then atoms had internal structure, and the question immediately arose, what else might they contain, and how were these pieces arranged? Thomson himself proposed a model, sometimes called the plum pudding model, in which electrons were embedded in a diffuse sphere of positive charge, like raisins in a pudding. The positive and negative charges balanced, creating a neutral atom overall, but the internal dynamics remained mysterious. The true structure emerged through one of the most famous experiments in physics history, conducted by Ernest Rutherford and his colleagues Hans Geiger and Ernest Marsden between 1909 and 1911. They took a thin sheet of gold foil, only a few atoms thick, and bombarded it with alpha particles, helium nuclei ejected from radioactive material. If Thomson's model were correct, these massive, fast-moving alpha particles should pass through the gold atoms with only slight deflections, like bullets through fog. Most of the alpha particles did exactly that, but a small fraction, perhaps 1 in 8,000, bounced back at large angles, some nearly reversing direction entirely. Rutherford later said that this was the most incredible event of his life, as astonishing as if a shell fired at tissue paper had rebounded and struck the gunner. The only explanation, Rutherford realized, was that the atom's positive charge and most of its mass were concentrated in an incredibly tiny, dense nucleus at the center, with electrons orbiting at relatively vast distances. Most of the atom, it turned out, was empty space, and when an alpha particle happened to strike a nucleus head-on, the electromagnetic repulsion sent it careening backward. This nuclear model of the atom, published in 1911, transformed physics. Suddenly, the atom resembled a miniature solar system, with a massive central nucleus and lightweight electrons in orbit, but this picture immediately presented problems. According to classical electromagnetic theory, an orbiting electron should constantly radiate energy, spiraling inward and collapsing into the nucleus in a fraction of a second. Atoms should be unstable, yet they persisted, endured for billions of years, radiated light only under specific circumstances, and when they did, emitted only certain specific wavelengths, not a continuous spectrum. Something was profoundly wrong with the classical picture, or profoundly incomplete. The resolution came from an unlikely direction, from the radical idea that energy itself might be quantized. This concept had emerged in 1900 when Max Planck, studying the spectrum of radiation emitted by hot objects, found that he could explain the observations only by assuming that energy was absorbed and emitted in discrete packets, quanta, rather than continuously. Planck himself was uncomfortable with this conclusion, viewing it as a mathematical trick rather than a Dokchuker description of reality, but the idea proved remarkably fertile. In 1913, Niels Bohr applied quantum thinking to the atom. He proposed that electrons could occupy only certain allowed orbits, each with a specific energy, and that electrons could jump between these orbits by absorbing or emitting precise amounts of energy corresponding to photons of specific wavelengths. This explained the discrete spectral lines observed in atomic emissions. It stabilized the atom by declaring that electrons in allowed orbits simply did not radiate, a postulate that defied classical physics but matched observation. Bohr's model was a hybrid, mixing classical orbits with quantum rules in a way that was logically inconsistent, and yet it worked. It predicted the hydrogen spectrum with stunning accuracy, and it suggested that the quantum world operated according to principles fundamentally different from the everyday physics of motion and force. The atom, once thought indivisible, now revealed itself as a structured entity containing a nucleus and electrons, governed by quantum rules that permitted only certain states. But the nucleus itself remained a mystery. What was it made of? How did it hold together? What determined which elements were stable and which decayed? Rutherford suspected that the nucleus contained positive particles, which he called protons, roughly 1,800 times heavier than electrons. The number of protons determined the element, hydrogen with 1, helium with 2, and so on up the periodic table, but the masses didn't add up. A helium nucleus, for instance, had 2 protons, but a mass roughly 4 times that of hydrogen, suggesting the presence of something else. Some additional neutral particles seemed necessary to account for the mass. This missing piece, the neutron, remained elusive for years, undetected because its lack of charge made it invisible to the methods that had revealed electrons and protons. It was not until 1932 that James Chadwick, also working at the Cavendish, definitively identified the neutron through careful experiments with beryllium radiation. Now the atomic nucleus had a clearer picture. Protons and neutrons, collectively called nucleons, bound together in an incredibly tight cluster with electrons occupying quantum states around this core. But binding nucleons together presented yet another puzzle. Protons carry positive charge, and like charges repel, the electromagnetic force should blow the nucleus apart, yet nuclei remain stable, often for billions of years. There had to be another force, something stronger than electromagnetism at very short distances, something that could overcome the electrical repulsion and hold nucleons together. This force, eventually called the strong nuclear force, operated only across distances comparable to the size of the nucleus itself, roughly a femtometer, but within that range, it was the most powerful force in nature. By the early 1930s, physics had descended beneath the atom, revealed the nucleus, identified 3 fundamental particles, the electron, the proton, and the neutron, and recognized that at least 2 fundamental forces governed their behavior, electromagnetism and the strong force. The picture seemed almost complete. Matter built from 3 types of particles, governed by understandable forces, but nature, as it turned out, was far stranger and far richer than anyone yet imagined. The first hint that the picture was incomplete came from the sky itself, from cosmic rays, high-energy particles that constantly rained down upon the Earth from space, streaming in from distant stellar explosions, from the sun, from sources still not entirely understood. In the 1930s, physicists began sending detectors aloft, carried by balloons into the upper atmosphere, and buried deep underground to study these mysterious visitors. What they found was bewildering. Cosmic rays, when they struck the atmosphere, created showers of secondary particles, and among these particles were things that didn't fit the known categories. In 1936, Carl Anderson, studying cosmic ray tracks in a cloud chamber, observed a particle that curved in a magnetic field exactly like an electron, but in the opposite direction. It had the same mass as an electron, but carried a positive charge instead of negative. This was the positron, the first antimatter particle ever detected, predicted just a few years earlier by Paul Dirac through purely theoretical reasoning. Dirac had been working on an equation to describe electrons in a way consistent with both quantum mechanics and special relativity, and his equation, beautiful and precise, produced two sets of solutions, one for particles with negative energy, which seemed nonsensical. Rather than dismiss these solutions as mathematical artifacts, Dirac proposed that they represented actual particles, mirror images of electrons with opposite charge. He called them anti-electrons. Though the name positron soon took hold, the discovery confirmed a profound principle that for every particle there might exist an antiparticle, identical in mass but opposite in charge and certain other properties. When particle and antiparticle met, they could annihilate, converting their entire mass into energy in accordance with Einstein's equation. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. This opened a strange new chapter. The universe now contained not just matter, but antimatter. And the question arose, why does our world seem built almost entirely from matter, with antimatter appearing only fleetingly in high-energy events, vanishing almost as soon as it forms? That question remains incompletely answered even now, but in the 1930s, it was merely one puzzle among many. More peculiar particles emerged from cosmic ray studies. In 1937, Anderson and Seth Neddermeyer found evidence of another particle, heavier than an electron but lighter than a proton. They called it a mesotron, later shortened to meson, and specifically, this was the muon. The muon was deeply confusing, and it seemed to be a heavier version of the electron, identical in every way except mass, unstable, decaying in about 2/millionths of a second into an electron and two neutrinos. It participated in electromagnetic interactions, but not in the strong nuclear force. The physicist I. Rabi supposedly quipped, "Who ordered that?" expressing the bewilderment of the community. The muon served no obvious purpose in building atoms, had no clear role in nuclear structure, and yet there it was, a redundant copy of the electron existing for reasons no one could immediately fathom. Nature, it seemed, was not as economical as physicists had hoped. Meanwhile, theorists were grappling with how forces actually worked at the quantum level. Electromagnetism had been successfully described by quantum electrodynamics. QED, a theory developed through the 1930s and 40s by Feynman, Schwinger, Tominaga, and others. In QED, forces arose from the exchange of particles, specifically photons, the quanta of light. When two electrons repelled each other, they did so by exchanging virtual photons, particles that existed only briefly, borrowing energy from the uncertainty principle. mediating the electromagnetic interaction before vanishing. This was a radically different picture from classical physics, where forces were fields that permeated space. Now forces themselves were quantized, carried by particles, transmitted through discrete exchanges. The strong nuclear force, logically, should work similarly, and in 1935, Hideki Yukawa proposed that nucleons were bound together by exchanging particles he called mesons, analogous to how photons mediated electromagnetism. But Yukawa's meson had to be massive to account for the short range of the strong force, roughly 100 to 200 times the electron's mass. When Anderson's muon was discovered, many initially thought it was Yukawa's particle, but the muon interacted too weakly. It passed through matter almost unimpeded, not behaving at all like the strong force carrier that theory predicted. The true Yukawa particle, the pion, was finally discovered in 1947 by Cecil Powell and his team using photographic emulsions exposed to cosmic rays at high altitude. The pion came in 3 varieties: positively charged, negatively charged, and neutral, and it interacted strongly with nucleons, mediating the force that held nuclei together. Now the particle landscape was becoming crowded. Electrons, protons, neutrons, positrons, muons, pions, neutrinos. Each new discovery raised new questions. Were there patterns, families, underlying principles that governed which particles could exist? The situation grew more complicated throughout the 1950s. Physicists built increasingly powerful particle accelerators, machines that could smash protons and other particles together at high energies, creating conditions similar to those in the early universe, allowing new particles to materialize from pure energy. And particles appeared in abundance, strange new particles that decayed in unfamiliar ways, particles that seemed to violate expected symmetries, particles that appeared only in pairs, particles with lifetimes ranging from stable to almost instantaneous. The kaon, discovered in 1947, exhibited particularly odd behavior. It was produced copiously in high-energy collisions, suggesting it formed through the strong force. Yet it decayed slowly, as if governed by a much weaker interaction. This strange behavior led physicists to introduce a new quantum number called strangeness to classify these particles and predict their interactions. Then came the baryons, heavy particles, including the proton and neutron, but also many others. The lambda, the sigma, the psi, the omega, each with distinct masses and quantum properties, each fitting into families that suggested underlying patterns without revealing the pattern's origin. And the mesons multiplied. Beyond the pion, there were kaons, eta mesons, rho mesons, dozens of variants, all unstable, all decaying through various channels into lighter particles. By the early 1960s, hundreds of particles had been discovered, and the field faced a crisis of complexity. This couldn't be the fundamental level. It seemed inconceivable that nature required hundreds of elementary particles, each with arbitrary properties. There had to be a deeper layer, a more economical description. The breakthrough came from seeking patterns in the chaos. Murray Gell-Mann and Yuval Ne'eman independently proposed a classification scheme in 1961, organizing particles according to their quantum numbers, arranging them in geometric patterns they called the Eightfold Way, after the Buddhist path to enlightenment. These patterns had gaps. empty spaces where particles should exist if the symmetry was real, and in 1964, one of these predictions was spectacularly confirmed. The omega-minus baryon, predicted by the pattern but never observed, was found in bubble chamber photographs at Brookhaven National Laboratory with exactly the properties Gell-Mann had specified. This suggested that the symmetries were real, that particles were not arbitrary, but fell into families governed by deeper principles. But what created these patterns? What underlying structure could explain the eightfold way? Gell-Mann proposed an answer in 1964, one that seemed almost absurd at first. He suggested that protons, neutrons, and all other baryons and mesons were not fundamental at all, but were composed of even smaller entities he whimsically named quarks, borrowing a word from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. According to this scheme, there were three types of quarks, which he called up, down, and strange, each carrying a fractional electric charge, something never before observed. The up quark carried a charge of positive 2/3. The down and strange quarks each carried negative 1/3. A proton consisted of 2 up quarks and 1 down quark, giving a total charge of positive 1. A neutron contained 1 up and 2 down quarks, giving 0 charge. Mesons were quark-antiquark pairs, while baryons were combinations of 3 quarks. This model explained the eightfold way perfectly, predicted particle masses and quantum numbers, and reduced the hundreds of observed particles to combinations of just 3 fundamental constituents. But there was a problem. Nobody had ever seen a free quark, ever. Despite intensive searches, quarks appeared only in bound states, never in isolation. This seemed bizarre. If protons were made of the quarks, why couldn't you knock a quark loose? The answer, it turned out, lay in the peculiar nature of the strong force itself. Unlike electromagnetism, which weakens with distance, the strong force grew stronger as quarks were pulled apart, like a rubber band that becomes harder to stretch. Try to separate quarks, and the energy invested eventually becomes sufficient to create new quark-antiquark pairs, which bind with the original quarks, forming new composite particles, rather than freeing individual quarks. This property, called confinement, meant that quarks were permanently imprisoned within larger particles, observable only through their collective behavior, their combined quantum numbers and masses. Throughout the late 1960s and early 70s, the quark model gained acceptance, but it required modification. Deep inelastic scattering experiments, where electrons were fired at protons at very high energies, revealed that protons contained point-like constituents, confirming the quark hypothesis, but also showing that quarks themselves carried only about half the proton's momentum, suggesting something else was present. That something else turned out to be gluons, the carriers of the strong force itself. Just as photons mediated electromagnetism, gluons mediated the strong interaction between quarks, binding them into protons, neutrons, and mesons. But gluons had a unique property. Unlike photons, which carried no electric charge and thus didn't interact with each other, gluons carried a type of charge related to the strong force, a property called color charge, and gluons could interact with other gluons, creating a self-reinforcing field that grew stronger with distance, explaining confinement, the theory describing quarks and gluons, called quantum chromodynamics, or QCD, became the accepted description of the strong force, paralleling quantum electrodynamics but with crucial differences arising from gluon self-interaction. Meanwhile, the weak force, responsible for certain types of radioactive decay, was being unified with electromagnetism through the work of Glasgow, Weinberg, and Salam. They showed that at high energies, electromagnetism and the weak force were aspects of a single electroweak interaction, mediated by four particles, the photon and three massive bosons called the W+, W-, and Z0. These massive force carriers were predicted in the 1960s but not observed until 1983, when CERN's particle accelerator finally achieved sufficient energy to create them, confirming the electroweak theory and earning its architects the Nobel Prize. The structure was becoming clearer, but gaps remained, tantalizing hints that the picture was still incomplete. By the mid-1970s, physicists had organized their knowledge into what became known as the Standard Model, a comprehensive framework describing all known particles and three of the four fundamental forces. It was an extraordinary achievement, unifying decades of experimental discovery with elegant mathematical principles. The matter particles, the fermions, fell into two categories: quarks, which participated in the strong force and came in 6 types or flavors: up, down, strange, charm, bottom, and top, and leptons, which did not feel the strong force, including the electron, muon, tau, and their associated neutrinos. These 12 particles, 6 quarks and 6 leptons, arranged themselves into 3 generations, 3 families with identical properties except for mass. The first generation contained the up and down quarks, the electron, and the electron neutrino, the building blocks of ordinary matter. The second generation, heavier and unstable, included the charm and strange quarks, the muon and the muon neutrino. The third, heavier still, contained top and bottom quarks, the tau and the tau neutrino. Why 3 generations? Why not 1 or 5? Nobody knew. The pattern suggested deeper structure, but the reason remained hidden. The force carriers, the bosons, included the photon for electromagnetism, 8 gluons for the strong force, and the W and Z bosons for the weak force. Each mediated interactions between matter particles according to specific rules, coupling strengths and symmetries. But even as this framework solidified, questions persisted. The most glaring concerned the origin of mass itself. In the Standard Model's equations, particles should be massless. Giving them mass by hand, simply inserting mass values into the equations, destroyed the mathematical consistency, violated the symmetries that made the theory work. Yet, obviously, particles had mass, electrons, quarks, the W and Z bosons, all possessed definite masses measured to extraordinary precision. The resolution, proposed in 1964 by several physicists, including Peter Higgs, François Englert, and Robert Brute, involved a radical idea that empty space itself was not truly empty, but filled with an invisible field, the Higgs field, permeating all of reality. Particles acquired mass by interacting with this field. The stronger the interaction, the more mass the particle possessed. Photons, which didn't interact with the Higgs field at all, remained massless, while the top quark, with the strongest coupling, became the heaviest fundamental particle known. This was more than a mathematical trick. If the Higgs field existed, then quantum theory predicted it should have an associated particle, the Higgs boson, a quantum of excitation in the field itself. Finding this particle became one of the great quests of experimental physics, but it would require enormous energies to create, far beyond what any 1960s accelerator could achieve. The Higgs boson, if it existed, was heavy, and creating heavy particles required enormous collision energies. Thanks again to mass energy equivalence, decades passed. Accelerators grew larger, more powerful, more precise. The Large Electron-Positron Collider at CERN, operational from 1989 to 2000, searched without success, ruling out lighter masses but unable to reach high enough energies to probe where the Higgs was most likely to hide. Meanwhile, other pieces of the Standard Model were falling into place with stunning confirmations. The top quark, predicted by the pattern of generations but stubbornly absent from experiments, was finally discovered in 1995 at Fermilab's Tevatron Collider. It was extraordinarily heavy, about 185 times the mass of a proton, so heavy it decayed almost instantaneously, never forming bound states, existing only as a fleeting signature in detector data. The tau neutrino, the last of the Standard Model leptons to be directly observed, was confirmed in 2000, again at Fermilab, completing the roster of matter particles, but the Higgs remained elusive, its discovery waiting for a machine powerful enough, precise enough, capable of sifting through trillions of collisions to find the rare events where a Higgs boson briefly materialized before decaying into other particles. That machine, the Large Hadron Collider, began operations in 2008, built in a circular tunnel 27 kilometers in circumference, buried up to 175 meters beneath the Swiss-French border. It accelerated protons to 99.99999% the speed of light, smashing them together with energy 7 times greater than any previous collider. The scale was staggering. Superconducting magnets cooled to near absolute zero, detector systems weighing thousands of tons, millions of sensing elements recording particle trajectories, energies, identities, collaborations involving thousands of physicists from dozens of countries, analyzing petabytes of data, searching for subtle signatures against overwhelming backgrounds. And on July 4th, 2012, CERN announced the discovery, a new particle, consistent with the Higgs boson, observed independently by 2 different detector collaborations, ATLAS and CMS. Each had collected sufficient data to claim discovery, seeing an excess of events at a mass around 125 billion electron volts, exactly where a Higgs boson would produce such a signal. Further analysis confirmed the particle's properties, its spin, its decay modes, its couplings to other particles. Everything matched predictions. The Higgs field was real, the mechanism for mass generation confirmed, and the Standard Model was complete, at least in its particle content. This was a triumph, a validation of theoretical physics' power to predict phenomena decades before experimental confirmation. But it was also, in a sense, a disappointment. The Standard Model, for all its success, was clearly incomplete. It said nothing about gravity, the fourth fundamental force, which remained described only by general relativity, incompatible with quantum mechanics at fundamental levels. Attempts to create a quantum theory of gravity had produced mathematical infinities, problems with renormalization, obstacles that decades of effort had not overcome. The Standard Model could not explain dark matter, the invisible substance that dominated the mass of galaxies, outweighing ordinary matter by factors of 5 or 6. Astronomical observations left no doubt that dark matter existed, and yet none of the Standard Model particles fit its properties. It had to be something new, something beyond the known roster. Nor could the Standard Model account for dark energy, the mysterious component causing the universe's expansion to accelerate, making up roughly 70% of the total energy density of the cosmos. This was completely outside the framework, unexplained, barely even addressed. The matter-antimatter asymmetry remained puzzling. The Standard Model predicted some asymmetry through CP violation in the weak force, but not nearly enough to explain why the universe contained matter and essentially no antimatter. Some additional mechanism, some new physics, seemed necessary. Neutrinos, once thought massless, had been shown through oscillation experiments to possess tiny but non-zero masses. They changed flavor as they traveled, electron neutrinos becoming muon or tau neutrinos and back, a quantum phenomenon requiring mass differences. Yet the Standard Model had no mechanism to give neutrinos mass, at least not in its original formulation, and there were aesthetic issues. 25 free parameters, masses and coupling strengths that had to be measured rather than predicted. Why did the top quark have one mass and the electron another? Why were the forces' strengths what they were? The Standard Model described these values but didn't explain them. Many physicists suspected that the Standard Model was an effective theory, accurate within a certain energy range, but ultimately an approximation of something deeper, more fundamental. Just as Newtonian mechanics emerged as an approximation to relativity at low speeds, perhaps the Standard Model emerged from a more complete theory at energies higher than current accelerators could reach. Theories beyond the Standard Model proliferated. Supersymmetry proposed that every fermion had a bosonic partner and vice versa, doubling the particle content but potentially explaining dark matter and stabilizing the Higgs mass. String theory suggested that particles were not point-like, but tiny vibrating strings, with different vibration modes corresponding to different particles, unifying all forces, including gravity, in a 10 or 11-dimensional framework. Extra dimensions, grand unified theories, Technicolor, Preon models, each offered potential solutions to some problems while introducing new questions, new predictions, new levels of complexity. But experiments at the Large Hadron Collider found nothing beyond the Higgs. No supersymmetric particles, no extra dimensions, no unexpected resonances. The data matched Standard Model predictions with almost unsettling precision, leaving physicists in the strange position of having a theory that worked beautifully but remained deeply unsatisfying. The frontier had shifted. No longer were physicists discovering new particles every few years. Instead, they refined measurements, constrained possibilities, searched for tiny deviations from predictions that might hint at new physics, looked to rare decays, subtle asymmetries, anomalies in muon magnetic moments or B-meson decays. And they looked outward to neutrino detectors buried in Antarctic ice or deep in Japanese mines, to gravitational wave observatories detecting ripples in space-time from colliding black holes to dark matter detectors waiting in abandoned mines for the rare interaction of a dark matter particle with ordinary matter. The questions had changed from what particles exist to what lies beyond what we know, from discovering the next layer to understanding why this layer has the structure it does. Particle physics had reached a curious plateau. The standard model reigned supreme within its domain, tested to exquisite precision, confirmed in thousands of measurements, and yet everyone knew it was incomplete, a chapter in a longer story whose next pages remained unwritten. The field settled into a new rhythm, building more sensitive detectors, conducting longer experiments, analyzing data with greater sophistication, searching for the subtle, the rare, the unexpected, waiting for nature to reveal the next clue, the next anomaly that would point toward deeper truths. And in this waiting, in this patient observation, there emerged a different kind of understanding, not of new particles, but of the achievement already realized, the profound knowledge already won. From this vantage point, with the landscape of particle physics spread before us like a completed map of terra incognita, certain patterns emerge that transcend the mere catalog of particles and forces. There is first the recurring theme of symmetry, woven through every level of understanding. Symmetries dictate which interactions can occur, which conservation laws must hold, which particles can transform into others. The mathematics of symmetry, group theory, becomes the language through which nature's preferences express themselves. When a theory possesses a symmetry, something remains unchanged under transformation, rotate space, and the laws of physics remain identical. Shift time forward or backward, and the equations hold their form. These symmetries, so abstract in mathematical expression, manifest as conservation laws, energy, momentum, angular momentum, the bedrock principles that govern every interaction. But particle physics revealed deeper symmetries, internal symmetries unrelated to space and time. The strong force, for instance, treats all quark colors identically: red, green, blue, arbitrary labels for symmetry that ensures gluons couple to color charge regardless of which color a quark carries. This SU3 symmetry, as mathematicians call it, generates the 8 gluons and determines their interactions. The electroweak force emerges from another symmetry, SU of 2 times U of 1, relating the electromagnetic and weak interactions, showing them as facets of a unified whole, only appearing separate because the symmetry is hidden, broken by the Higgs field, like a perfectly symmetric vase that falls and shatters. The pieces remember their origin, retain traces of the original form, but the symmetry is no longer manifest. This breaking of symmetry, this transition from unified to separated, likely occurred in the early universe when temperatures dropped below a critical threshold and the Higgs field acquired its non-zero value, condensing throughout space like dew forming on grass at dawn. In that moment, the unified electroweak force split. Particles acquired masses, and the universe took on the character we observe today. There is something profound in this, the apparent complexity, the different forces with different strengths and ranges, the hierarchy of particle masses. All this diversity emerges from symmetry breaking, from a kind of cosmic phase transition. The underlying reality is simpler, more unified, but hidden beneath the broken symmetry we inhabit. And then there is the matter of scale, the extraordinary range of magnitudes that particle physics encompasses. A proton measures roughly 1 femtometer across, 1/quadrillionth of a meter. Inside that proton, quarks are confined to even smaller scales, effectively point-like as far as experiments can tell, possibly smaller than 10 to the minus 19 meters, a billionth of a meter. Yet to study these infinitesimal objects, we build machines of enormous scale. The Large Hadron Collider's 27-kilometer ring, its thousands of magnets, its hundreds of millions of sensor channels, its energy budget matching a small city's, all this to probe distances so small that light itself crosses them in times measured in yoctoseconds, septillionths of a second. The disproportion seems almost comical, and yet it reflects a deep truth about nature. To see smaller, you need higher energy. Higher energy requires stronger fields, bigger accelerators, more elaborate detectors. The frontier of the small demands instruments of the large, linking the study of fundamental particles to engineering projects of monumental ambition. And there is the peculiar relationship between the very small and the very large, between particle physics and cosmology, the conditions that existed in the first moments after the Big Bang, when the universe was unimaginably hot and dense, can be recreated briefly in particle collisions. The quark-gluon plasma, a state of matter where quarks and gluons roam freely rather than being confined in protons and neutrons, existed throughout the cosmos for the first few microseconds, and now exists again for fleeting instants in heavy ion collisions at CERN and Brookhaven. The Higgs mechanism, which gives particles mass, operated differently in the early universe. At sufficiently high temperatures, the Higgs field vanished. Symmetry remained unbroken. Particles were massless. Only as the universe cooled did the field condense, the symmetry break, masses appear. Understanding particle physics thus becomes a way of understanding cosmic history. The relative abundances of elements, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the large-scale structure of galaxies, all these depend on particle interactions in the early universe, on cross-sections and decay rates and coupling constants measured in modern laboratories. We look inward to the smallest scales and find ourselves looking backward to the earliest times. The microscope becomes a telescope, peering not across space but across time, to moments when the universe fit within a volume smaller than an atom, when all the matter and energy we observe today existed in a state of almost incomprehensible density and temperature. There is also the role of uncertainty, not merely as experimental error, but as fundamental principle. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the impossibility of simultaneously knowing both position and momentum with arbitrary precision, manifests throughout particle physics. It allows virtual particles to appear, borrowing energy for brief moments, mediating forces before dissolving back into the quantum foam. It permits quantum tunneling, where particles cross barriers they classically shouldn't penetrate, enabling nuclear fusion in stars and radioactive decay in unstable nuclei. The quantum vacuum, far from being empty, seethes with virtual particles, particle-antiparticle pairs constantly appearing and annihilating. The energy of this vacuum, calculated naively, comes out absurdly large. 120 orders of magnitude larger than the observed dark energy density. This vacuum catastrophe, this spectacular failure of prediction, remains one of physics' most embarrassing unsolved problems. And yet, the quantum vacuum has measurable effects. The Casimir effect, where two uncharged metal plates attract due to modified vacuum fluctuations between them. The Lamb shift, a tiny energy difference in hydrogen's spectrum caused by electron interactions with virtual photons. These confirm that the vacuum is not nothing, but a dynamic, fluctuating medium. Particle physics thus reveals a universe that is never still, never truly empty, never fully determinate, a universe where observation affects reality, where particles exist in superposition until measured, where the act of detection collapses possibility into actuality. Finally, there is the human dimension, easily overlooked amid equations and detector specifications. Thousands of physicists collaborate on single experiments, sharing data, co-authoring papers with author lists that scroll for pages. Their work requires patience, building detectors over decades, taking data for years, analyzing events that occur perhaps once in a trillion collisions. They develop new technologies that ripple outward into society: superconducting magnets, advanced computing, particle therapy for cancer, medical imaging, grid computing, the World Wide Web itself, invented at CERN to help physicists share data. All this emerges from the quest to understand nature's fundamental structure, and they pursue knowledge for its own sake, driven by curiosity about how things work, what the world is made of, why reality has the form it does. These questions have no immediate practical application, no quarterly earnings impact, no 5-year strategic value, and yet they represent something essential about human nature, the impulse to understand, to question, to seek patterns in apparent chaos. The story of particle physics is thus also a story about what it means to be human, to ask questions whose answers require generations to unfold, to build collaborations across borders and languages, to seek truth in the face of uncertainty, to pursue beauty in mathematical structure, to find meaning in understanding. And so we return to where we began, to the invisible realm beneath the surface of things, now perhaps with different eyes. The particles dancing in the quantum foam, the quarks confined within protons, the neutrinos streaming through the earth, the Higgs field permeating space, all these continue their ancient patterns, indifferent to observation, governed by laws that permit no exceptions, the electrons flowing through the circuit of the device reading these words, the quarks in the atoms of your body, the photons carrying signals, all participants in the same quantum dance described by the Standard Model, all following rules discovered through decades of patient inquiry. There is a kind of peace in this understanding and recognizing that beneath complexity lies pattern, beneath diversity lies unity, beneath apparent chaos lies mathematical order. The universe, at its deepest explored level, consists of 12 matter particles, 4 force carriers, and 1 scalar boson, all interacting according to principles of symmetry and quantum mechanics. From this sparse inventory, everything emerges: atoms and molecules, chemistry and biology, stars and galaxies, consciousness and thought. We are quite literally made of particles whose properties were unknown a century ago, whose very existence was unsuspected for most of human history. The atoms in our bodies contain quarks that have been confined since the early universe, electrons that will outlast the stars. We are temporary patterns in a sea of quantum fields, arrangements of fundamental particles held together briefly by forces now understood in exquisite detail. And yet, for all this understanding, mystery remains. The Standard Model, complete in its domain, points beyond itself, hints at deeper structures, suggests questions it cannot answer, dark matter and dark energy, gravity and quantum mechanics, the hierarchy of masses, the number of generations. All these await explanations not yet found. Perhaps future accelerators will reveal new particles, new forces. Perhaps observations of cosmic rays or neutrinos or gravitational waves will provide the crucial clues. Perhaps the next breakthrough will come from unexpected directions, from mathematical insights or astronomical observations or careful reconsideration of existing data. Or perhaps we have reached the limits of what particle colliders can teach us. Perhaps the next layer lies at energies forever beyond our reach. Perhaps we must learn to extract truth from precision rather than discovery, from subtle measurements rather than dramatic new particles. Either way, the journey continues, the questions evolve, the patient work proceeds. In laboratories scattered across the world, detectors wait in the darkness, recording the rare, the subtle, the unexpected. Superconducting cavities accelerate particles to nearly light speed. Magnets bend their paths into collisions. Electronics capture the debris. Computers reconstruct events. Physicists analyze patterns, searching always for the anomaly, the deviation, the hint of something new. And in the quiet spaces between measurements, in the pauses between collisions, in the gaps between one discovery and the next, there is simply the particles themselves, existing as they always have, governed by principles that precede human understanding and will outlast it. The quarks and leptons, the bosons and fields, the symmetries and interactions, all continue their eternal dance, indifferent to names we give them, unconcerned with our theories, simply being what they are, following the rules written into the structure of reality itself. We have glimpsed that structure, traced its outlines, measured its parameters, built models that predict and explain, and in doing so, we have touched something fundamental, something true, something that transcends the particular moment and speaks to the underlying nature of everything. This is what particle physics offers, not certainty, not completion, but a map of the deepest territory yet explored, a description of the foundations upon which everything rests, a glimpse into the quantum realm where reality reveals its most basic character. And now, as the words slow, as the journey through the particle landscape draws towards its end, we can rest in that knowledge, let it settle, allow the patterns and principles to fade gently into the background, like stars disappearing at dawn, still present, still real, but receding from immediate view. The particles remain, doing what they have always done and what they will always do, existing at scales beyond sight, following laws beyond everyday experience, building from their simple interactions the entire complexity of the observable universe. And we have followed them into that hidden realm and returned, carrying with us perhaps a sense of wonder, an appreciation for the depth beneath the surface, and a quiet recognition that reality, at its foundation, is stranger and more beautiful than we ever imagined. The quantum fields vibrate on, the forces mediate, the symmetries hold, and the universe continues particle by particle, interaction by interaction, moment by moment, as it has and as it will, in patterns now partly known, partly understood, and partly still wrapped in mystery.